At the charity gala, my son stepped onto the stage, raised his glass, and smirked down at the investors. "I left that poor last name behind so I could rise," he said. "No million-dollar brand wants to be tied to an old man who scrubs floors at night." Laughter spread across the room. I sat near the stage in my old maintenance uniform, my chest tightening, but my hands stayed calm. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. Because before the night ended, that very microphone would destroy everything he thought he had won. What struck me at 2 o'clock in the morning landed with the force of something I couldn't walk away from. He'd made a habit of it, never once mentioning a father who worked nights, not when serious money was in the room. There I was, motionless, in the Glenwood Terminal staff break room, my tea halfway to my lips, eyes fixed on his face filling the television screen. 68 years old, 3 decades of guiding a motorized floor polisher across that cold limestone floor, unseen by the late-night travelers who swept past without a glance at these hands worn steady by years of unglamorous, honest labor. Yet the man speaking on that podcast had found a way to take that invisibility and aim it like something sharp, something meant to cut. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into this one, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Just one word, what's your mood right now as you settle in to listen? Content, restless, hopeful, whatever fits, drop it down below. Now, a quick note before we begin: some elements of this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. Gavin Wyndham, 34 years old, slate gray suit cut to perfection, every inch the self-invented tech billionaire he'd rebuilt himself to be. The Harwick name scrubbed from every professional profile. "That's how you scale, son," Gavin continued, leaning into the microphone with the ease of a man who'd never once questioned his own words. "You shed the story you were handed at birth." Sterling Cole, the podcast host on screen, pushed forward with the hungry energy of someone who sensed a viral moment taking shape. "So, your roots became a liability." "Not a liability," Gavin replied without missing a beat. "Just irrelevant to the rooms I needed to be in." The 3 co-workers who'd been eating their midnight meals went quiet, the kind of quiet that thickens the air. Eyes moved between the screen and where I sat. Lenora from maintenance shifted uncomfortably. Cedric made a show of studying his sandwich wrapper. The third one, a co-worker whose name I barely caught, said nothing at all. "We didn't know he was going to..." Lenora began, her voice dissolving into that hollow gap between sympathy and not knowing what to say. I set down my tea with the same measured care I'd used to raise that boy working double shifts when Hazel got sick, never letting a mortgage payment slip, never skipping a parent-teacher conference. The remote was sitting on the break room table. I picked it up, pressed the power button, and let the screen go dark. "The floor in Terminal B needs finishing before the morning commute," I said, keeping my voice even. Cedric opened his mouth, thought better of it, and closed it again. I walked out of that break room with my back straight and my pace steady, the way Hazel had always walked, the way she'd taught me to. Her voice came back to me from those last months before cancer took her in March. Her quiet counsel on patience and dignity had been the thing I'd anchored myself to ever since. Patience builds stronger foundations than anger ever could. She used to say, her hand warm in mine even when the chemo left her cold. Back in the main terminal, I returned to my motorized floor polisher, its familiar hum settling around me like a kind of shelter against the echo of my son's words. The night stretched out the way it always did. Floors to clean, windows to polish, the unseen work that kept the city moving. 6 hours later, I was standing in my small house near the rail yard when my phone lit up like something had gone haywire. Text after text, vibrations rattling the kitchen table. From Cedric, "Harold, this is blowing up everywhere." From Lenora, "That tech CEO is your boy." Then, "Just saw the honorary wall photo match." And from numbers I didn't recognize. "We got your back, brother." Links, screenshots. The podcast clip cut down to a 90-second reel titled, "Outgrow the Story You Were Born Into." I tapped one link and watched the view count climb in real time. 47,000, 48,000. Comments poured in faster than I could follow. Then somebody posted a photograph, the Glenwood Terminal honorary wall of service. My face 30 years younger but still recognizably mine. My name in bronze letters, Harold Harwick, night custodian, 1987 to 2017. The connection ripped through the comments like a brush fire. "Wait, is that the night janitor?" He's literally talking about this man. Bro has his own father's name on a wall of honor and still threw him to the wolves. Imagine 30 years at the same place and your son treats you like something to be ashamed of. How do you measure the weight of a name? In my son's world, you weigh it in investor confidence and boardroom access. In mine, you weigh it in 3 decades of honest labor and calloused hands that built his college fund, paid for the coding boot camp that launched his career, and never once asked for recognition or a single apology. I sat at my kitchen table as the November morning light came through the curtains Hazel had sewn 15 years ago. The house was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that turns a man's thoughts toward the choices his children make and the distance that opens up when pride crowds out gratitude. My phone buzzed again, another message from the night shift group thread full of solidarity and quiet outrage. Good people. People who understood that dignity isn't something you outgrow. It's something you earn one honest shift at a time. But beneath all those messages of support, beneath the viral storm my son had touched off, something else was moving in my chest. Not anger, not even grief exactly. Just a low, steady certainty that Hazel's counsel on patience was about to be tested in ways I hadn't foreseen. The view count crossed 200,000. My son had no idea what he'd set in motion. Because what Gavin didn't know, what none of them knew, not Sterling Cole, not the investors, not anyone sharing that clip, was that the invisible janitor they'd dismissed was holding something worth far more than any title or corner office. I walked to my bedroom floorboards, creaking under my work boots. My phone buzzed once more. I glanced at the screen, expecting another message from the crew. Instead, an unlisted landline number stared back at me. No name, no area code I recognized, just a string of digits and a single line of text that raised the hair on the back of my neck. You are the custodian of the key. Look to your perimeter. I held those words in my eyes for a long moment. Whoever sent this knew something about me that even my son had never uncovered. Someone was watching, waiting. I knelt beside the bed and peeled back the corner of the worn rug Hazel and I had found at a flea market in 1989. The loose floorboard beneath it had guarded our secrets for decades. Time to find out whether those secrets were about to become something else entirely. The rug pulled back the floorboard, pried loose, and there it was. The combination safe that held the answer to that cryptic message. My fingers moved through the numbers without thinking. Hazel's birthday, then mine, then the day we married. The lock turned with the same solid click it had made 30 years ago when we'd fitted it into place together, her hands steadying mine as we worked. "This isn't your money, Harold," she'd said that day, her voice firm even through the fatigue that already carried the shadow of an illness we hadn't yet named. "It's a promise to every person who works in the shadows. Protect it." Inside the safe, a set of pristine legal documents rested in their fireproof sleeve. I lifted them out with the same careful hands that had polished floors for 3 decades, spread them across the bed, and began to read. The Harwick Family Legacy Trust. Active. Current valuation $38 million. I had studied these pages countless times since Hazel passed in March. Every clause, every stipulation, every protection she and our attorney had built into the framework, I knew them cold. But reading them now, with my son's voice still turning in my head about outgrowing the story he was born into, the words carried a different gravity. Section 4. Subsection B. The honor and integrity parameters. Beneficiaries must bear the family surname with dignity and pride, demonstrating through public action their commitment to the values of honest labor and working-class stewardship. Any beneficiary who legally abandons the family name publicly, disparages the trust grantor's occupation or heritage, or demonstrates contempt for working-class communities shall be immediately and permanently disqualified from all distributions. I read it again, then a third time. Gavin had legally changed his name to Wyndham 5 years ago. The court notification had come to me and I'd filed it away, told myself it was branding, just business, nothing personal. Then came the public mockery on a podcast now reaching millions through the viral clip. He had violated every single parameter. The irony landed like a blow I hadn't braced for. My son had spent years assembling a Silicon Valley empire, cultivating relationships with billionaires, constructing the perfect self-made mythology. And in doing so, he had walked away voluntarily from $38 million he never knew existed. He traded a fortune for an image consultant's advice, I said aloud to the empty room, my voice steady against the turmoil in my chest. What do you call a man who sheds his name to escape a legacy he didn't know was there? In Gavin's case, you call him exactly what he set out to become, somebody else's son. I sat on the edge of the bed, the document spread before me like a map of decisions made and consequences approaching. Hazel had seen this day as a possibility. She'd pushed hard for those honor clauses, worked with our attorney for months to make them airtight, challenge-proof. Wood shaped with patience becomes a masterpiece, she used to say out in the garage workshop where I'd first learned to work with my hands. Wood forced too quickly splinters beyond repair. The November afternoon light filtered through the curtains, laying long shadows across the truss papers. Outside, the rail yard kept up its familiar rhythm. Inside, I reached my decision. By 9:15 that evening, I was in the garage workshop, old wood and mineral oil, a smell as natural to me as breathing. My battered work journal lay open on the workbench, and I wrote out my governing principle in careful block letters. Never retaliate out of anger. Correct through absolute truth. Then I picked up my phone and dialed the number I'd carried in my head for 30 years. Grant Whitmore picked up on the second ring. His voice held the unhurried steadiness of a man who'd guided the Harwick family through legal terrain since long before Gavin drew his first breath. 56 years old, a practice built around ordinary working people, the attorney Hazel had handpicked to hammer the trust's honor clauses into something unbreakable. "Caught the viral clip," he said. "Figured my phone would ring." "Then you already know what I need. The time has come, Grant. Those protective honor enforcement clauses, I need them activated." Silence stretched across the line. A drawer scraped open on his end. Papers shifted. "Harold." His register dropped into the careful, measured tone he kept for moments of genuine legal peril. "The moment they get wind of this, an incapacity petition lands on a judge's desk. They'll argue that the shock of going viral has left you mentally unfit to control $38 million. Barrett Windham has the kind of money that turns that argument into a court order by Tuesday." None of this surprised me. Hazel had laid it out plainly years back, right around the time we'd finished putting the trust together. Wealth like Barrett's didn't absorb defeat, it redirected it. Old money treated working people as inventory to be deployed or friction to be eliminated. "Which is exactly why our groundwork needs to be solid before they realize what they're up against," I said. "Agreed. Give me 48 hours. I'll need to compile the court record on the name change, certified transcripts from the podcast, the analytics data showing the disparagement was public and deliberate. And we'll need a clean medical evaluation confirming your fitness plus financial documentation that demonstrates responsible trust stewardship." A pause, a slow measured breath. "Harold, I want to be direct with you. Once those clauses are formally triggered, once this becomes a legal proceeding, there's no quiet way back from it. Gavin finds out about the trust, Serena finds out, Barrett finds out, and every one of them comes at you with the full weight of what they can afford." Hazel used to say that wood shaped with patience becomes a masterpiece. But wood rushed through the saw splinters past saving. I was about to learn whether that principle held when the thing being shaped was justice. "I understand all of it," I said, keeping my voice level. But Hazel didn't spend months crafting those clauses so they'd collect dust. She put them there to stand for every person who does their work in the dark unseen. Grant recited the trust's preamble quietly from memory. Then, "All right, I start pulling records at first light tomorrow. But listen carefully. If they get that petition filed before our documentation is airtight, if a friendly judge signs off, they could suspend your trustee authority before you've made a single move. We don't have the luxury of moving slowly." I dropped my eyes to my battered work journal. The 2 lines I'd written stared back up at me. "Never retaliate out of anger. Correct through absolute truth." "Then let's not waste another hour," I said. "They'll try to strip your authority." "I know. Make sure they fall short." The battle lines formed before Gavin had any notion a war existed. Grant moved without hesitation. 4 days on his high-speed scanner ran steadily inside his downtown Denver office, drawing out every buried digital fingerprint from the podcast production files. I sat across his desk and watched the monitor accumulate file names, timestamps, correspondence headers, the full apparatus of a proper investigation, cracking open what people assumed the internet had quietly swallowed. "Take a look at this," Grant said, nudging the monitor toward me. "Email thread between Sterling Cole and a PR consulting firm fired off 3 days ahead of the broadcast." He opened the message. I leaned in. What I read made something cold settle in my jaw. "Keep the night janitor segment in the final cut," Grant read aloud. "Guaranteed rage bait metrics. The CEO's ruthless personal brand evolution will play beautifully with our Series B investors. Client sign-off required before air." The scanner's hum was the only sound left in the room. So it wasn't just that my son tolerated the insult. I said the words coming out slow and deliberate. Someone wrote a check to keep it in. Grant's expression didn't soften. He opened a second document, a corporate filing packed with dense ownership language. Apex Brand Solutions, the PR firm behind the production, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Wyndham Capital Ventures. His finger traced the ownership chart where it branched downward. Your son's father-in-law personally arranged for his own son-in-law to gut you on camera and called it a marketing strategy. I stared at the name on the filing. Barrett Wyndham. It had crossed my radar when Gavin married Serena 3 years back. Old money, investment capital, the variety of fortune that picks up influence the way most people pick up groceries. Barrett understood exactly how this would travel, Grant went on. He wanted Gavin to read as ruthless someone who'll sever any tie that doesn't pull his career forward. That's the particular mythology venture money pays to cultivate. The realization settled the way grime settles on Glenwood Terminal's upper windows, invisible until the morning light finds it at precisely the right angle. Gavin hadn't stumbled into using me as a punchline. He'd been steered there carefully and deliberately by a man who'd figured out that contempt properly framed sells like confidence. Does this hold up in court? I asked. Absolutely, in the right context. It establishes orchestrated, intentional reputational harm. If they move forward with that incapacity claim, we turn around and show the court that the very stress they're pointing to was manufactured on purpose by Barrett's own operation. Who comes out ahead when a father becomes raw content? The podcast host sees his numbers climb. The consulting firm invoices and moves on. And my son gets handed the brand mythology of a man cold-blooded enough to bury his own origins. The invisible janitor just becomes the material someone else built a campaign from. Pull everything, I said. Every email thread, every filing, every metadata timestamp. If this is going to be a legal foundation, I want it to hold against whatever they throw at it. Grant's printer came alive. The next evening, I was on my front porch working to replace a board that had finally given up when a black pickup truck rolled to a stop at the curb. The woman who climbed out carried herself the way people do when they've stood on 1,000 front stoops and learned in the first 3 seconds whether a door will open or stay shut. 49, maybe 50. Practical jacket. A canvas shoulder bag worn soft from years of use slung over one shoulder. Her eyes held the focused clarity of someone who'd spent 20 years chasing labor stories that the major outlets couldn't be bothered with. Mr. Harwick, she said, statement not question. I set down the hammer and stood straight. Wrong house. Sylvia Kent. She held out a card I left in her hand. Investigative reporter. I'm not here to add to your pain, but there are people turning family bonds into engagement bait for profit. That's what I'm following. I took a moment to read her face. No crew waiting by the truck, no camera, just a woman, a notebook, and the particular patience of someone who'd learned that silence is sometimes an answer. Then follow the people building the weapons, I said, keeping my voice quiet. Not the ones on the receiving end. Something moved behind her eyes, a kind of recognition. 6 hours to verify the honorary wall connection, she said. Then 2 days sitting on it because the whole picture felt engineered, the timing too neat, the spread too fast, the payoff too clean for everyone but you. So you came out here for confirmation, I said. I came out here to tell you I'm not publishing confirmation, Sylvia said, placing her card on the porch railing since I clearly wasn't going to take it. What I am doing is pulling at the threads underneath. The anonymous Denver Foundation that filed papers last month, the PR infrastructure wired into the podcast, where the money actually flows. There's a story here about how working people get processed into content without a signature, without consent. I looked at the card. Henderson Investigations, a number, an address. Some stories belong to the people who lived them, I said. They were never anyone else's material to sell. That's exactly why I'm here. If the moment ever comes when you want to shape how this gets told, you call that number. Until then, nothing from this conversation sees print. That's not a courtesy, that's a commitment. She turned toward the truck, then stopped herself. Mr. Harwick, the tone had shifted, no longer probing, just acknowledgement. Whoever is running this operation, they haven't finished. A machine built to generate this kind of viral pressure doesn't throw one punch and stand down. They'll keep applying force until something gives. Then they're about to learn something about me, I said. She gave a single nod, climbed in, and pulled away. I lifted her card from the railing and worked it slowly between my calloused fingers. The November dusk carried the smell of diesel from the rail yard as deep in my memory as the sound of my own footsteps. 30 years of deliberate invisibility drifting through Glenwood Terminal, like a presence that kept the floors gleaming and the whole operation humming, noticed by no one. Oh, that arrangement was over now. As Sylvia's taillights curved out of sight, something at the edge of my vision stopped me. A black pickup truck sat parked at the dead end 50 yards down where the road gave out against the old warehouse fence. High beams blinked once, twice, measured and intentional. Then the truck went still, engine running unhurried, the posture of something that wanted to be seen without being approached. I stood there on that porch, Sylvia's card pinched between my fingers, watching it watch me. Whoever was behind that wheel had resources, and they'd traced exactly whose name kept appearing in the wrong conversations about Harold Harwick. The message was clear enough: we see you. What they hadn't accounted for was that I'd stopped flinching at being seen. I didn't sleep that night. The truck was gone by midnight, but the message it left behind clung like diesel smoke. Someone with serious reach wanted me to understand that I was cataloged, noted, tracked, entered into whatever private ledger billionaires maintain on people who become inconvenient. The following morning, I drove through November rain to Grant's office. The pen felt heavier than it had any right to as I put my signature to the final incorporation papers, bringing the Invisible Vanguard Fund into official existence. There, Grant said, pressing his notary seal with the practiced economy of a man who'd legitimized 1,000 documents before this one. As of 9:47 a.m. on November 8th, you are the anonymous benefactor behind a fully registered Colorado charitable foundation. I set down the pen and studied the bylaws we'd spent 3 days shaping. The foundation's purpose: higher education scholarships, emergency relief support, and trade certification programs, but exclusively for the children of Denver's night shift logistics workers, the people the morning commuters never see, the ones who kept everything humming while everyone else was asleep. The primary donor's identity is sealed behind the shell corporation, Grant said, indicating the relevant clause. The legally registered agent is me. Every dollar that moves will be documented and legally transparent. When they start digging, what they'll find is a foundation that's airtight and untouchable. How long before Barrett Wyndham's people locate the Capitol Trail? I asked. Grant's expression held the measured calm of a chess player who'd already worked out the next 6 moves. The bait is in the water. The apex predators will bite. When they do, we'll know precisely who's hunting you and what they're willing to deploy. I thought about that black pickup truck, those 2 deliberate blinks of the high beams. Barrett Wyndham wasn't simply wealthy, he was the variety of wealthy that arrives with investigative teams and forensic accountants, attorneys whose whole practice was finding what other people had tried to bury. You're using my own foundation as bait, I said. I'm using visibility as a weapon, Grant replied. A defense conceals what you're guarding. A trap lets the hunter see just enough to commit to the chase. He slid a folder across the desk, thick with incorporation certificates, tax filings, the full machinery of legal standing. This foundation is real, Harold. It's going to do genuine good for real families. But it's also a flare thrown into the sky announcing here is a substantial charitable entity with anonymous funding tied to someone deep in Denver's working-class infrastructure. Barrett's investigators will trace it inside a week, probably less. And when they do, Grant continued, they'll chase every public record, pull every financial thread, try to stitch it back to you. While they're occupied with that paperwork, we'll be watching them, learning who they hire, what methods they favor, how far they're prepared to go. The Invisible Vanguard Fund wasn't only charity, it was reconnaissance. The trust documents stay separate, I confirmed. Entirely, Grant said. They'll find the foundation. The trust stays dark until you decide otherwise. I signed 3 more documents, each one another layer of protection, another breadcrumb dropped on the trail I was laying for Barrett Wyndham to follow. The next evening I was in the garage working on Hazel's old sewing table when my phone lit up with an unfamiliar notification. Encrypted message, unknown number. I opened it. Mr. Harwick, this is Serena Gavin's wife. I am so incredibly sorry for the podcast footage. I had no idea they would shape his backstory into that specific angle. Please believe me. I held the screen in front of me for a long moment. Serena Wyndham, 31, elegant in the designer clothes I'd glimpsed across Gavin's social media, had married my son believing she'd found genuine substance beneath the ambition. The encrypted channel suggested a conscience that her father and husband had long since misplaced. My thumb rested above the keyboard. Hazel's voice came back to me, what she'd said about judging people by what they do when things get hard, not by how they perform when everything's comfortable. I typed with care. If you truly had no part in this, then I'd suggest you start watching their actions very closely. The reply came in seconds. I am. That's exactly why I'm writing. My father doesn't know I have this phone. Gavin doesn't know I'm reaching out, but I can't keep sitting here acting like I don't see what's in front of me. Before I could answer, another message followed. My father is running an asset investigation into an entity he believes you're concealing. He has forensic accountants pulling financial registries. I don't know what specifically he's looking for, but he is certain it exists. The garage walls seemed to draw closer. Grant's trap was springing faster than we'd planned for. I typed, "Why are you telling me this?" The pause before her response stretched nearly a full minute. "Because you raised Gavin. You worked nights so he could go to college. You never asked for recognition or for anything to be paid back. And now your own son is letting my father turn your dignity into a corporate branding exercise. That's not the man I believed I was marrying. And it's not the father-in-law who deserves what's being done to him." Serena was caught in the narrow space between the family she was born into and the one she'd married into, watching her own father orchestrate the calculated dismantling of her father-in-law, while her husband served as the willing instrument, and she was the only one left with enough conscience to send a warning into the darkness. "How much does your father know?" I typed. "He knows the viral video generated public sympathy around working-class stories. He knows an anonymous foundation just incorporated in Denver with a mission tied to night shift families. He's convinced you're behind it. His team is pulling incorporation records, cross-referencing your name against every legal filing in the state." I looked at Hazel's sewing table. She'd used it to hang curtains, take in my work uniforms, hem Gavin's school clothes during the lean years. She'd understood that the most dangerous adversaries aren't the ones fueled by hatred. They're the ones who see you as an obstacle blocking something they want badly enough. "Thank you for the warning," I typed. "I don't know what they're going to find," Serena wrote. "But whatever you're protecting, protect it fast. My father doesn't stop until he's won." The phone screen glowed with her final words, weighted with everything she knew about the kind of man Barrett Wyndham was. He was convinced it existed, and he was hunting. Barrett Wyndham was closing in with forensic accountants, legal teams, the sort of resources that can surface anything if given enough time. But time was the one resource I was about to take away from him. Serena's warning reduced everything to a single clean calculation. Barrett was hunting, and I had exactly 18 days to turn his hunt into the trap. Grant Whitmore's corkboard filled the wall behind his desk the next morning, a sprawling chronological timeline with one date circled in thick black marker, November 28th, 2017. "This is everything," Grant said, pressing his finger against the date hard enough to rock the board. "At midnight on the 28th, the trust undergoes its mandatory 5-year restructuring evaluation. Every beneficiary gets measured against the honor and integrity parameters your wife built into the original documents." I studied the timeline. Grant had mapped every significant date since the video broke. November 2nd, podcast airs. November 6th, email metadata uncovered. November 8th, Foundation incorporated. November 9th, Serena's warning. Then November 28th, ringed like a target. "Hazel designed this mechanism," I said, remembering the late evenings at this desk when she'd been adamant about building what she'd called accountability architecture into the trust structure. "She did," Grant confirmed. "And she made you the sole active trustee specifically so you'd hold executive authority to submit the verified beneficiary qualification list. If Gavin is formally logged under the willful lineage disparagement penalty clause, he faces an automatic 12-month evaluation freeze. 0 distributions, 0 access, 0 appeal window, not until he demonstrates restoration of family honor through documented measurable action." I stepped to the corkboard and traced the timeline with one finger. 18 days. The same span it had taken me to teach Gavin to ride a bike when he was 6. Patient repetition. Let him fall, help him up, never do the work in his place. "This isn't about punishment," I said. "No," Grant agreed. "Hazel built in a conditional redemption pathway. The trust doesn't destroy him. It forces him to choose between the Silicon Valley identity he's constructed and the actual family legacy he walked away from. 12 months to show through documented action that he values the Harwick name enough to reclaim it both legally and publicly." The irony was plain enough. My son had shed his surname to escape what he saw as working-class baggage, and in doing so had voluntarily surrendered the one thing that could have secured his future far beyond any Series B funding round or investor confidence metric. "What exactly happens on November 28th, I asked. Grant lifted a thick binder from the shelf and opened it to a tabbed section marked Restructuring Protocol. At 11:59 p.m., the trust's current beneficiary designations expire. At 12:01 a.m. on the 29th, new designations take effect based on the trustee's submitted qualification list. You hold executive authority to determine who passes the honor evaluation and who doesn't. The legal mechanism triggers automatically the moment you submit that list, binding for the next 5-year cycle." Did my son have any idea what he'd surrendered when he traded his surname for a PR consultant's advice? Not only the fortune Hazel and I had spent decades protecting, but the opportunity to steward a promise his grandmother had made to every unseen worker keeping this city moving past midnight. If I log Gavin under willful disparagement, I said, he's frozen for a year. No trust capital, no distributions, no emergency withdrawals, correct? Correct. But here's the part that matters most. Hazel didn't make it permanent. She built in restoration criteria. If Gavin can demonstrate genuine commitment to family values, publicly acknowledge his heritage, and actively support working-class communities, the freeze lifts at the next evaluation cycle. She gave him a way back, I said quietly. She gave him a test, Grant corrected. 12 months to show whether his actual identity means more to him than the one he invented. The office phone cut through the room. Grant glanced at the caller ID and something in his face changed, shifted from explanation into alertness. It's the probate court clerk, he said, picking up. Grant Whitmore. I watched his face as he listened. The color left his cheeks the way water drops from a wrung cloth. When was it filed? His voice was tight. He grabbed a pen and scratched something on his notepad. November 20th. He wrote it down. 8 days from now. He lowered the receiver slowly, hand still wrapped around it. What happened? I asked, though the weight already settling over the room had told me most of it. Barrett Wyndham's legal team filed an emergency petition with Denver County Probate Court. Each word came out measured and deliberate. They're demanding a court-ordered conservatorship and forensic cognitive evaluation. Their argument is that the stress of going viral has left you mentally unfit to manage a multi-million-dollar estate. The air in the room felt suddenly scarce. They're moving to strip my trustee authority, I said. Before November 28th, Grant confirmed. If they prevail, Barrett gets appointed conservator. He takes control of the trust, submits his own beneficiary qualification list, and Gavin remains fully qualified, regardless of the disparagement clause. Your son collects the fortune, Barrett acquires the influence, and you get declared mentally incompetent in public court records. I thought about that black pickup truck and its deliberate signal, about Serena's warning that her father was hunting, about the email metadata proving Barrett had orchestrated the viral humiliation from the start. The war had begun, its front line drawn in probate filings and trust restructuring clauses, and Gavin had no idea his father-in-law had already fired the opening rounds. What evidence are they using? I asked. The petition claims erratic behavior following viral media exposure. They'll argue that a 68-year-old janitor threatening to mismanage $38 million out of spite toward his successful son represents clear cognitive decline and emotional instability. Grant crossed to the fax machine and pulled the petition free, still warm from printing. The legal language was dense, clinical, crafted to dismantle a man's dignity with the same precision Barrett's PR firm had used to engineer viral content. They're using my age against me, I said. Your age, your occupation, and the stress they manufactured on purpose. Grant's jaw tightened. It's elegant in a sociopathic way. They engineered the crisis, then filed legal action claiming the crisis is proof you're unfit to respond to it. When's the hearing? November 20th, 8 days before the trust deadline. 18 days had become 8. The timeline pinned to Grant's corkboard looked less like a calendar now and more like a fuse burning towards something irreversible. Can we beat this? I asked. Grant held my gaze with the steadiness of a man who'd spent 30 years preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Beat it, he said. Harold, we're going to demolish it, but we have to move fast and we have to be flawless. Barrett Wyndham just had the poor judgment to wage a legal war in the one arena where 30 years of disciplined, documented competence becomes an unbreakable wall. He handed us our defense. He passed me the petition. They filed to have you evaluated for mental incompetence. We're going to show that court precisely what competence looks like. The marble corridor of Denver County Probate Court returned our footsteps as Grant and I moved toward the clerk's window where Barrett Wyndham's legal strike sat waiting in a folder. The encrypted message had arrived at midnight, petition filed. 6 hours on, I was standing in a courthouse smelling of floor polish and old paper while Grant produced his identification to retrieve the documents designed to strip away my civil rights. The clerk pushed the folder across polished granite. Grant opened it. I watched his jaw go hard as he scanned the first page. Conservatorship petition, he said, voice low. Emergency hearing November 20th. They're not wasting time. I kept my hands quiet while he began reading aloud, his tone clinical, his eyes sharp with measured anger. Respondent demonstrates erratic decision-making patterns consistent with age-related cognitive decline exacerbated by recent viral media stress. His threats to restructure a $38 million trust out of personal vendetta against his son constitute clear evidence of emotional instability and fiduciary incompetence. Grant looked up. Signed by Diana Colton, lead counsel. Diana Colton. I'd come across that name before, a 52-year-old attorney who had made her reputation placing corporate interests over individuals who dared to push back against entrenched power. Barrett had retained the sharpest predator his money could lease. They're turning my age and my work into weapons, I said. Grant nodded, leafing through the supporting affidavit. They're using the crisis they manufactured as evidence that you can't handle the crisis. Circular logic designed to erase your rights before you can mount a defense. I read over his shoulder. The petition cast me as a bewildered old man emotionally destabilized by his son's viral success poised to ruin family wealth out of bitter jealousy. Every paragraph bent the truth into something clinical. 40 years of disciplined night shifts became evidence of social isolation. Financial privacy became paranoid secrecy. My measured silence after the podcast became a communication deficit. They had taken the weapon they'd forged, viral humiliation engineered to elevate my son's personal brand, and reframed it as proof I was too fragile to be trusted with my own affairs. Forensic cognitive evaluation required before November 28th, Grant continued. They want a court-appointed psychiatrist to assess your capacity. One finding of even mild impairment, and they can freeze the trust pending full conservatorship proceedings. November 28th. The deadline I'd built toward was now their target. Barrett knew the trust structure. He knew the timeline. He was using the courts to seize control before I could execute the transfer. Can they actually win? I asked. Grant closed the folder deliberately. In probate court with a favorable judge and the right expert witness, they can absolutely win, especially when they frame it as protecting a vulnerable elderly man from his own deteriorating judgment. The clerk's telephone rang in the background. Footsteps moved past us. Other people carrying their own legal burdens, their own family fractures playing out in manila folders. Then we need to prove I'm not deteriorating, I said. We need to prove considerably more than that. Grant's expression was grave. We need to establish that they engineered this entire situation specifically to manufacture the appearance of decline. We need to document the fabricated crisis, expose the circular reasoning, and demonstrate that your decisions, unconventional as they appear, are the product of a clear mind and a deliberate plan. He gathered everything into his briefcase. I'll arrange a comprehensive neurological evaluation with an independent specialist, Dr. Adrienne Foxworth. Brilliant, unimpeachable, and her testimony isn't available to the highest bidder. If she certifies you as cognitively sound, Colton's case falls apart. We walked back through the marble corridor past courtrooms where judges were ruling on who deserved rights and who deserved to be shielded from their own choices. That evening, I was midway through my shift at Glenwood Terminal when my phone buzzed inside my pocket. Gavin's number lit the screen. I stepped into the old phone booth alcove. The actual phones had been gone for years, but the wooden housing remained, offering a small pocket of quiet away from the terminal floor's constant noise. Hello, son. Dad. His voice carried that particular rhythm I'd learned over decades, the same calibrated empathy he used in investor presentations measured for emotional impact while risking nothing personal. I heard about the legal situation. I'm worried about you. This level of stress at your age, with everything that's been happening online, I think we need to talk about getting you some support. Support. The word floated between us like smoke. Support, I said back. That's an interesting choice of words for what Barrett's lawyers are attempting. Silence. Traffic sounds filtered through from his end. He was outside somewhere, pacing through whatever performance he'd prepared. This isn't about Barrett, Gavin said, and I could hear the script underneath the rhythm, the coached concern. This is about making sure you're protected, that you have help managing complex decisions. 40 years of quiet, deliberate stewardship of building something real while no one was watching, and they wanted to reduce it to confusion, requiring intervention. A late train eased into the terminal behind me, passengers flooding toward the exits, none of them registering my presence. The janitor is always invisible. How do you measure the gulf between a father and his son? In my case, you measure it in the dead air that opens up on a phone line when a simple question meets a man with no honest answer. I put it to him plainly, voice low, but without tremor. If there were no inheritance, no trust, nothing with my name attached, would you wake up tomorrow and take back the name Harwick? He didn't answer, not right away. What I could hear was his breathing, the street noise on his end, and the precise moment when the rehearsed warmth he'd been projecting ran dry, no publicist at his elbow to suggest a response. 10 seconds. 20, 30. When he finally spoke, everything cordial had drained out of him. I'll be back in Denver next week, Gavin said. We handle this properly, legally, not as father and son, as legal adversaries in a probate proceeding. One designed to rule on whether I was competent enough to hold my own civil rights. I ended the call. My son wasn't coming home to defend me. He was coming to help Barrett take everything. The conservatorship filing wasn't Barrett's scheme alone, it was a joint operation. Father-in-law and son-in-law aligned to have an inconvenient old man declared unfit and cleared from the path to $38 million. What they didn't know was what I'd spent 4 decades quietly assembling. I gathered my supplies and went back to the floors. Hands steady, mind tracking every piece on the board as the clock ran toward November 28th. They pictured a disoriented janitor. They had no idea they were stepping into a trap 40 years in the making. Gavin, confirming he'd returned to settle things legally, told me only what I already knew: he'd chosen his side. 24 hours later, I saw exactly how coordinated the assault truly was. Sterling Cole's camera crew appeared in the fluorescent glare of Glenwood Terminal's empty concourse before his voice reached me. Predators choose ground where their target works alone. It was 1:30 a.m. The last passengers had cleared the terminal 20 minutes earlier, leaving only the hum of my motorized floor polisher and the sound of my own footsteps. Then the lights hit. Professional LED panels converting the dead-of-night terminal into something clinical and merciless. Mr. Harwick. Sterling Cole's delivery carried that polished podcast sincerity warmth engineered for an audience wrapped around pure commercial intent. He advanced with 2 camera operators flanking him, microphone leveled like a weapon. You've become the center of a viral conversation about family betrayal. Are you the bitter janitor trying to ruin your self-made son's career out of jealousy? I switched off the polisher. The hum dropped away. 3 cameras running. This was not journalism. It was a production. I fixed my gaze on the center lens. I'm doing my job, I said, voice flat and even. You're converting a family's private pain into profit. Something shifted in Sterling's face. He'd anticipated flustered denial, not a direct answer. He moved to the follow-up he'd prepared. So you deny sabotaging your son's success because you resent how far he's come? The question was a trap. Either way, my answer barely mattered. They had their footage. I have nothing to deny, and I owe you nothing, I said. This ambush changes nothing about what has to happen. I have work to finish. I restarted the machine. The polisher's noise swallowed whatever Sterling threw at my back. Security cleared the crew out 3 minutes after that. By 3 a.m., the footage was uploaded and spreading. Sylvia's text lit up my phone. The edited version makes you look unstable. Not journalism. Evidence custom built. Still in my dark gray work uniform, I watched the clip on my laptop. 90 seconds of surgical editing. My words about profiting from family pain, isolated context stripped away, made me read as erratic and confused. Comment sections filled with people diagnosing cognitive decline and emotional instability, borrowing the exact clinical language Barrett's petition had already introduced. They hadn't filmed an interview. They'd manufactured a court exhibit. Coordinated media ambush. Every element pointed at one target, proving I was too unstable to be trusted with my own affairs. Grant called at 3:15 a.m. Barrett's attorneys will file that video in probate court as Exhibit A for cognitive decline. The ambush was planned. They built it. Then we pull the full unedited footage, I said, and show exactly how it was assembled. Harold, understand the scope here, Grant said. This is systematic, coordinated, professional. They're constructing an evidentiary record aimed at stripping your civil rights before you can mount any real defense. I understood the scope. What I needed was an answer to an attack that thorough. It arrived the following afternoon at the Switchyard Diner, a truck stop booth, rain loud against the windows, air stale with burnt coffee and grease. Grant and I were already seated when Devin Crane dropped into the chair across from us. 36 years old, worn down by years of watching a false history go unchallenged and finding no one willing to listen. He'd built the company alongside Gavin from the start, 2 young men with no money and no connections, scraping for angel investment, their shared working-class origins central to everything they pitched. Then he'd watched his co-founder quietly sand those origins away for a better story. These pitch decks from 2012 show Gavin selling the bootstrap son of a janitor story to angel investors, Devin said. His hands weren't fully steady as he pushed an encrypted flash drive across the table. He built our entire Series A around coming from nothing, around knowing what real struggle feels like. Then he married into Wyndham Money and deleted you. New surname, company origin rewritten, suddenly claiming a prep school background he never had. Grant moved through the files on his laptop. Documentary proof of deliberate fraud. Investors purchased a narrative your son already knew he was abandoning. Devin's fear sat right on the surface. There's an NDA. If I go public, Barrett drowns me in legal fees I can't cover. He's threatened it twice already, once over the rebrand, once when I raised questions about equity dilution that happened to land right after Gavin became Wyndham. I looked at the tired man across from me. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from watching someone revise reality in plain sight while you have no standing to object. I know it well. Barrett handles dissent quietly, Devon went on. NDA suits slap actions legal costs that drain you before you ever reach a judge. He stays in the dark because daylight is the one thing he can't afford. Then we move you somewhere daylight can't be blocked, I said. Public enough that retaliating becomes more costly than backing down. Devon weighed that. What he grasped and what I was learning to articulate was that men like Barrett Windham don't fear truth itself. They fear the venue that makes truth impossible to smother. Make the stage wide enough for the whole industry to see, Devon said slowly. Do that, and I'll step onto it. But it has to be big enough they can't make me disappear. The drive held the full record pitch materials packaging poverty as a selling point, internal emails mapping the pivot to old money branding documentation showing how his father had been methodically cut from the founding story. Proof that Gavin Windham's celebrated origin myth was a commercial product calculated from the start. Devon's caution was earned. Barrett had built his power on burying opposition before it surfaced, making the cost of telling the truth prohibitive to anyone without the resources to absorb it. The terms were non-negotiable, a stage visible enough, public enough, that retaliation would play out in front of everyone Barrett needed to impress. I already knew the answer. The Foundation's annual gala set for November 27th, one day ahead of the trust deadline, was exactly that stage. First, though, I had to know what Barrett was actually preparing. On November 14th, a video connection opened between my small Denver house and Serena's San Francisco mansion. I felt it immediately, the particular unease of a bridge already straining under what it was about to carry. Serena's face filled the screen and I barely recognized my daughter-in-law. The composed confidence from the wedding photographs was gone, replaced by exhaustion, guilt, something close to desperation. She sat in what looked like a home office, expensive furnishings arranged around her like a portrait of wealth that offered no comfort. "Please," she said, voice carefully controlled. "We have to find a way through this before it breaks everything apart. Gavin doesn't have the full picture." And then movement behind her. He walked into the shot, the way men walk into rooms they already own, unhurried, certain carrying the weight of old money like a second skin. Barrett Windham, 72 years old. Silver hair not a strand out of place, wearing a blazer that probably costs more than my monthly salary. His hand came to rest on Serena's shoulder. The move looked like tenderness, but what it said was stay put. When he spoke, his voice held that particular contempt reserved for people old money has already decided don't matter. What your son-in-law fails to grasp, Serena, is that this conversation has no point. He pushed closer to the camera, making himself large in the frame, making sure I got the full picture. Old man, you don't have the faintest idea how modern capital actually functions. Sign the management transfer. Amateur resistance like yours only ends one way. And there it was, the voice I had heard behind every move, every maneuver, every quiet escalation. The real architect stepping out of the dark at last. Barrett Windham wasn't merely my son's father-in-law. He had been the hand on the strings from the moment Gavin swapped his surname. "I understand how capital functions perfectly well," I told him, holding my voice steady. "The thing you can't seem to grasp is that not everything carries a price tag." Barrett's smile didn't reach anything cold, rehearsed, long since perfected. "Everything has a price, Mr. Harwick. You simply haven't been shown the bill." Serena's hand jerked sideways and the feed went black. 5 seconds passed. My phone lit up with an encrypted message. "Serena, I'm sorry I tried. He has his hands on everything now." A second message came so fast on its heels she must have still been in the room with him when she typed it. "They have a pre-written public confession ready for Gavin to deliver at the charity gala November 27th. The script portrays you as fully senile, devoted son, stepping forward to spare a beloved father the burden of managing his own affairs." Then a third. "The gala is their kill shot. National media will be in that room. The whole thing is coordinated character assassination built to give their conservatorship petition the public justification it needs." I sat with the phone in my hands and watched the messages stack up like the last pieces of something I had been trying to see whole for months. Barrett Windham wasn't merely my son's father-in-law. He was the designer of a system whose entire purpose was converting family into financial leverage, and my son had signed on as its most enthusiastic operator. November 27th. The very evening I had been shaping as Devon's public moment was already Barrett's designated kill zone. He had timed his scripted performance to land the day before the trust deadline, positioning it for the sharpest possible legal and reputational impact. But in doing so, Barrett had made one irreversible mistake. He let me see the blueprint. Next morning, I was sitting across from Grant in his office when he read aloud from an email that had arrived through a source inside Gavin's company, somebody whose conscience had finally caught up with them. From Gavin Wyndham, Grant said, "Jaw tight to Apex Brand Solutions. Subject podcast, final cut approval. Leave the janitor line in. It creates perfect friction narrative. It's exactly the personal brand evolution that scales." The timestamp, November 6th, 2017. 3 days before that podcast dropped. Grant lifted his eyes from the screen, and I saw an expression on his face I almost never see. Raw shock, not at the mechanics of it, at the sheer willingness. "He signed off on it," I said, in writing, on corporate letterhead. "This goes beyond a PR department running wild," Grant said. "Your son made a deliberate, documented choice to greenlight his own father's humiliation as a brand strategy." The email glowed on the screen, corporate header clean formatting, every authentication tag in order. Sender verified, timestamp confirmed, corporate domain authenticated. Gavin had watched the pre-release cut reach the section where Sterling ridiculed his father's job and handed down a business ruling, keep it because the friction serves the narrative. My degradation had been processed through a corporate approval chain the same way you'd approve a logo revision. Grant printed it out and slid it into the evidence folder, the one that already held Devin's pitch decks. Serena's encrypted warnings, Sterling's staged footage, and Barrett's conservatorship filing. Barrett's PR operation ran the whole play, Grant said, arranging the documents by date. Gavin signed off in writing. Sterling engineered the ambush. The Gala script is drafted and waiting. This is a systematic, deliberate campaign to destroy a family for financial gain. I worked through the sequence Grant had laid out until every link was visible. Barrett had brought in the PR firm. The firm had designed the podcast strategy. Gavin had approved the public humiliation. Sterling had cornered me on camera for the bonus footage. Barrett had lodged the incapacity petition. And now they had put Gavin's words in his mouth for the Gala, the remorseful son doing what love required. The November 27th event is where they intend to land the killing blow, I said. Grant didn't disagree. We had moved past defense. What we were building now was a mirror, ground flat and true one my son would be forced to stand in front of until he saw the reflection clearly. "We're making him look at something he won't be able to look away from," Grant said, shutting the evidence folder with a finality that reminded me of a gavel coming down. "Every document in here shows him exactly who he chose to become the day he put investor confidence ahead of his own father." The Gala would proceed on November 27th on Barrett's schedule. National press would fill the room just as he had arranged. Gavin would walk out on that stage with his prepared remarks just as they had drilled. But in the time remaining, Grant and I would quietly rebuild what that stage meant, turn it into something Barrett Wyndham had never factored into his calculations. A public accounting. Every email surfaced, every corporate signature exposed, every step of their coordinated betrayal documented and presented to an audience that couldn't be bought off or frightened into silence. They had committed one fatal error in their planning. They put it all in writing, the humiliations, the approvals, the attack orders, every stroke of it captured in corporate records that would now serve as evidence in a performance of an entirely different kind. Barrett had chosen the battlefield. I would be the one who decided what happened on it. Owning the stage meant Barrett could not be allowed to keep his sharpest weapon. That weapon was the claim he'd staked his entire legal argument on, the idea that I was cognitively unfit. The examination room had that particular antiseptic smell, quiet and clinical, as Dr. Adrienne Foxworth worked steadily through her evaluation forms, recording the results of every test I had completed with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. Dr. Foxworth was a court-appointed independent neurologist, 28 years building a reputation for calling it straight, having watched too many manufactured incompetence claims cross her desk to be fooled by one now. She knew the difference between actual decline and legal theater. Grant had asked for her by name for exactly that reason. By November 16th, I had been inside that clinic since 9 in the morning. 5 hours, neurological evaluation, memory assessment, psychiatric screening, executive function tasks, spatial reasoning exercises, the full battery, every test calibrated to find whatever cognitive deterioration Barrett's petition insisted was making me a danger to my own finances. "Mr. Harwick," Dr. Foxworth said, eyes still on her forms, "I want you to give me the 3 objects I named 15 minutes ago during the spatial reasoning portion." Her pen sat ready above the page. Pen calendar buffalo, I said. You sequenced them that way to see whether I would conflate the order they were presented with the categories they belong to. The pen went still. She looked up. Something sharp and attentive moved behind her eyes. Exceptional, she said, and wrote at length. Your metacognitive awareness and pattern recognition sit well above what we typically see at your age. Grant was in the corner watching, saying nothing as agreed. He had laid it out for me that morning going to them, rather than waiting for them to come at me volunteering for a full evaluation ahead of the November 20th hearing, instead of simply reacting to Barrett's legal assault, was how you build a shield that holds. At 2:30 that afternoon, Dr. Foxworth walked us through her conclusions. Mr. Harwick demonstrates cognitive function consistent with individuals 30 years his junior, she said, and signed the document with unhurried authority. No evidence whatsoever of impairment, decline, or instability. She pushed the certified evaluation across the desk to Grant. This is airtight, Grant said, setting it into his briefcase with care. Barrett's argument was that the stress of going viral left you mentally compromised. This document says the opposite. Barrett had turned my age into a liability, made my occupation a punchline, exploited the viral wound his own hired firm had opened. Every piece of that arsenal was about to collide with clinical findings he had no mechanism to discredit. They engineered the breakdown to give the petition its legs, I said. And we just placed on record that I navigated their engineered breakdown without a scratch. Grant submitted the certified evaluation to the probate court that same afternoon, preemptive, not reactive. Barrett's entire case for incompetency depended on the image of a broken old man overwhelmed and adrift. Dr. Foxworth's findings, cold and precise and signed, erased that image completely. The following morning, November 17th, Grant and I were back at his office tightening the foundation Gala plan. November 27th, Gala. November 28th, trust restructuring deadline, Grant said, running his finger along the timeline we had mapped. That window gives you exactly 24 hours from the moment everything goes public to the moment the legal mechanism fires. Deliberate, exact. The Gala would pull everything into the open, Devin's evidence, Gavin's written approval, Barrett's orchestration, all of it put in front of witnesses whose accounts could not be suppressed or bought. 24 hours after that, the trust restructuring would execute, locking the foundation's capital into place before Barrett could file a single motion to stop it. Barrett built the Gala to finish me, I said. We're turning it into our stage. Devin Crane has to be visible enough beforehand that going after him becomes a liability for them, not an option. Sylvia had come in to help with media coordination. She glanced up from her laptop with something thoughtful working across her face. You're setting it up so Gavin and Barrett walk into their own exposure. We're not just setting it up, Grant said. We're making certain they have no reason not to show up right up until the moment it's too late to leave. Grant passed me 2 custom-printed invitations on heavy cardstock, the kind that signals VIP donor status before you've read a single word. I looked over the language we had drafted together. In recognition of your commitment to family values and community advancement, we invite you to join us at the head table for the Invisible Vanguard Fund inaugural gala. Each invitation bore a name, Gavin Wyndham and Barrett Wyndham, respectively, with front row VIP placement at the main table guaranteed. You're certain they'll actually be in the room when everything comes out? Sylvia asked. I set the invitations down, taking a moment to feel what they meant. They can show up and face the truth in front of every witness in that room, I said. Or they stay away and signal they already knew something had shifted. Either path leads them to the same place. The elegance of it was in how little it required. Barrett had scripted Gavin's compassionate confession for that evening, counting on the public setting to strengthen the conservatorship petition. He had personally arranged for national media regional business figures, all the spectators he needed for his performance to land. By sending these invitations, I was simply confirming that same audience would be present, assembled for something else entirely. If Gavin and Barrett declined, that retreat would announce that their prepared performance had been compromised somehow. If they came, they'd be seated at the head table the moment Devin Crane stepped up to the microphone, when the email metadata filled the screens, when every documented thread of their scheme was spread out in plain view of everyone Barrett himself had gathered. Hazel used to say patience wasn't something you waded through. It was the craft of letting those who mean you harm push so far forward into their attack that pulling back becomes more damaging than pressing on. I had just mailed Gavin and Barrett engraved invitations to a room they couldn't leave without proving they'd known all along what it was. Sylvia watched me seal the invitations into their certified priority mail envelopes. "Harold," she said quietly, "you've spent 3 decades being invisible by your own choosing. Are you prepared to walk out of that shadow?" I let the question settle. 40 years of night shifts. 40 years of watching people move through a building without once registering I was in it. 40 years of building something in silence while my son sold his authenticity for brand metrics and the approval of old money. "It's time," I said. Grant nodded and added a final note to the case file. "November 27th, he said. 10 days out and every thread pulls tight at once. The certified invitations went into the mail that afternoon. 10 days until all of it. Devin's pitch decks, the email metadata, Gavin's written sign-off. Barrett's coordination of the whole scheme was laid open before regional business leaders, labor organizations, and the national press Barrett himself had summoned. 10 days until the gala. Barrett had constructed as the moment he would end me became the stage where I would hold a mirror up to my son and refuse to let him look away. But before November 27th could arrive, the November 20th incapacity hearing would determine whether Barrett's legal team could strip my authority before my trap had any chance to close. That hearing was 2 days out, and before Barrett's lawyers could stand in court and argue I was unfit to manage my own affairs, I needed to give them something they couldn't help but chase bait so well placed that ignoring it would be against their nature. On November 18th, I walked through the banking lobby under the eye of the security monitors carrying paperwork that would serve as breadcrumbs for a very particular kind of predator. Raymond Hewitt, senior trust officer with 23 years handling high net worth accounts, received me in the private consultation room. He moved through sensitive financial transactions with the discretion of someone who had long since learned that privacy and transparency are tools, not principles, each valuable depending on what the moment calls for. "Mr. Harwick," he said, going over the foundation registration documents I had brought. "The registration requires a seed transfer drawn from the primary trust account. What figure did you have in mind?" Grant and I had worked out the number the evening before. Enough to appear in the disclosure registries, not enough to expose anything that mattered. 250,000, I said, visible without being vulnerable. Raymond noted it with a neutral expression that gave away nothing. "This will show up in the standard financial disclosure registries within 48 hours, he said. "Anyone tracking new foundation formations in this city will be able to see where the capital originated." That was the whole point. When the transaction authorization forms came across the desk, I signed each one with deliberate attention, making my requirements clear to Raymond as I did. "Run this through the standard public channels," I said. "No privacy protections, no reporting delays." Raymond's pen paused above the processing options. "This will be fully transparent," he confirmed. "Any search for foundation seed capital tied to Denver will connect directly back to your trust account." "That's exactly what I'm after," I told him. Grant reached me on my cell while Raymond was entering the final codes. "You're making yourself look exposed on purpose," Grant said when I walked him through it. "You're using yourself as bait." "Bait dangled from a line is predictable," I said, watching Raymond work at his terminal. "Using yourself as bait demands something different. You have to know with precision which kind of predator cannot walk past what looks like an easy wound." The transfer went through at 10:43 a.m., $250,000, moving from the trust account into the foundation registration fund, routed through every public transparency channel the banking system provided. The digital trail was unmistakable, exactly what Barrett's forensic accountants would be set up to find. I went back to Grant's office and waited. By 3 p.m., the secure monitoring systems Grant had built to watch public financial registries for incoming searches began throwing alerts. 3 separate forensic accounting firms queried Denver Foundation registrations within the past hour, Grant said, his eyes tracking the activity on his screen. I moved around behind his chair to watch the search patterns build. "Barrett's people," I said. "They've found the transfer." Grant confirmed it. "They're tracing the capital source right now." The bait had moved faster than either of us expected. The monitoring software logged every query, precise, sophisticated searches designed to surface new foundation formations, trace seed capital back to its source, and map financial relationships. Barrett had retained professionals who knew exactly what to look for. I had made sure they found it. We stayed with the data for another hour, watching the pattern confirm itself. Barrett's forensic team had turned up the foundation transfer, followed it back to the trust account, and were now building what they were certain was the record of my critical error. At 6:47 p.m., an anonymous text reached Grant's secure server. "Burner phone untraceable. but the substance of the message made identification unnecessary. Grant read it aloud, his voice carrying controlled satisfaction edged with something sharper. We see the money trail. Transparent foundation registration from trust account balance 38 million. Amateur mistake. A second text landed 15 seconds after. We will be at the gala. We are taking what belongs to us. I sat back across from Grant's desk and felt the mechanism engage, not like a plan coming together, more like a lock finding its tumblers one by one. They think the trust capital will be sitting in reach at the event, I said. They're planning to hit us legally right there in public. Barrett's team believed they had spotted the blunder that would hand them everything at the gala. What they had actually found was the snare that would make it impossible for them to walk out of that room when the real reckoning arrived. Grant pulled up the case timeline and dropped the threatening text into the evidence folder alongside Dr. Foxworth's evaluation, Devin's pitch decks, Gavin's email approval, Serena's warnings, and every other documented piece of what they had done. They're convinced the foundation transfer has left the trust exposed. Grant said that they can move against it during the gala. I thought about the architecture we had actually constructed, the layered protections Grant had built in the trust mechanisms, set into motion weeks ago. The capital that was already beyond Barrett's reach, regardless of what took place on November 27th. What they haven't accounted for is that the money is already gone from where they think it is, I said. The trust is secured. They're gearing up to seize something that won't be there when they reach for it. Grant leaned back, studying the threatening text on the screen. November 27th, he said. They'll walk in expecting to freeze vulnerable assets and find themselves staring at documented evidence of every move they've made. He read the text one more time, something uncommon sharpening in his voice. We see the trail. We are taking what belongs to us. The words sat in the air between us. Barrett's certainty, his absolute confidence that he had outmaneuvered an old man who ran a floor polisher for a living. His total commitment to a public confrontation he already believed he had won. They're coming to the gala, I said, not just Gavin with his prepared remarks. Barrett's full legal apparatus, forensic accountants, corporate counsel, ready to execute emergency asset freezes the moment the signal comes. They believe they're walking into the moment they finish this. Grant shut his laptop with a quiet, deliberate click. Good, he said. The more of their resources they deploy, the more people will be watching when we put everything they've done on the table in front of them. They're not just swallowing the bait, they're bringing the whole team. The anonymous text stayed with me. We see the money trail. We will be at the gala. We are taking what belongs to us. Before we go any further, I want you to sit with what is about to unfold, because what I discovered about the people closest to me changed the weight of everything that came after. I have to ask you this: if you found out someone you loved had been quietly working against you all along, would you confront them in the moment, or would you gather every piece of proof first and let the truth do the work? Barrett's forensic accountants had followed the foundation transfer, convinced they had uncovered my weak point, and locked themselves into a plan for a public ambush at the November 27th event. What they had no way of knowing was that the trust capital had already been moved, restructured, and placed well beyond anything they could touch. They were marshaling forces to seize assets that would not exist in the form they expected. And while their attention stayed fixed on that phantom target, Grant and I would lay out every email, every documented act of betrayal, every piece of accumulated evidence before an audience of national press, business leaders, and labor representatives, all there to see exactly what Gavin and Barrett had made of themselves. Barrett's team were girding for a seizure of vulnerable assets at the gala. What hadn't reached them yet was that those assets would by then have been restructured and moved permanently out of range. But before any of that, my son needed to show up and play his part. Gavin's arm settled across my shoulders with the easy warmth of a man who had practiced the gesture somewhere behind us at the luggage carousel at Denver International Airport. A camera shutter clicked. "Dad, it's been too long," Gavin said, his voice carrying that particular tenderness he saved for when there were people nearby to hear it. "We're here to look after you now." The November sky outside the arrivals terminal was the color of old concrete, and Serena stood just behind him, her face caught somewhere between guilt and exhaustion. At their backs, a man in his early 30s held a professional camera at the ready. "Colin, get a few more of these," Gavin said. "I want this documented." Colin Dre, the freelance photographer Gavin had engaged to build a paper trail of fabricated devotion. No spontaneous reunion this, a staged production with hired documentation built in from the start. I let Gavin's arm stay where it was and played my role in the production. 3 more clicks of the shutter, evidence being assembled frame by frame. The the dutiful son returning to protect his fading father, insulating himself against any future accusation of neglect. Every movement was thought through, every word pitched just loud enough to carry to the travelers around us. Every photograph composed to project concerned tenderness, the appearance of family bonds that hadn't actually existed in years. "Your home is exactly how I remember it," Gavin said an hour later, standing in the middle of my small living room. He had never lived in this house. It was purchased after he had gone off to college after Hazel was gone. But the line sounded right, suggested a continuity that wasn't there. I put on coffee while Colin set himself up in the hallway, capturing candid moments that were nothing of the kind. Serena barely said a word, perched on the edge of the sofa like a person attending a service they hadn't chosen to be part of. "How long does it take to dismantle a father's dignity?" 24 hours, 48. Long enough to manufacture the evidence that fits the conclusion you've already reached. November 20th. The following day, Gavin drove me to an exclusive dining club in downtown Denver, the sort of establishment where a membership inquiry begins with a net worth check, the sort of place where Barrett Wyndham felt entirely at ease doing business. Barrett was already at a corner table, leather portfolio, spread open legal documents laid out across the white linen like instruments before a procedure. "Harold," he said without rising, delivering my first name the way you drop something you no longer need. I took the seat opposite him while Gavin settled himself at the head of the table, not at my side, not at Barrett's, at the top. The geometry of it told you everything about how they had come to see the arrangement. Barrett slid a bound document across the table, thick pages, expensive paper. "Your original family name is a net negative liability to our public market valuation," Barrett said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who considers himself to be stating the obvious. "This settlement provides for your transition into luxury-assisted living care while transferring executive management of trust assets to professional administrators who understand modern capital markets." I turned through the pages at my own pace, reading passages that Grant and I had already worked through in the copy Serena had passed along. Voluntary medical residency, cognitive assessment protocols, transfer of fiduciary authority. Every clause engineered to strip my legal standing while presenting the whole thing as an act of care. "We will ensure you are protected from yourself," Barrett went on. "The stress of managing complex financial instruments at your age, given your occupation's limited exposure to sophisticated capital structures, creates unacceptable risk." My occupation. 40 years of disciplined night work reduced to a line of evidence against me. Gavin leaned in with his prepared part. "Dad, this is about making sure you're properly looked after," he said. "The assisted living facility is exceptional private suite, full medical staff, a full range of activities designed for your demographic." Your demographic. Age as grounds for disqualification. I set the document down without haste, conscious of the Foundation Gala invitation folded inside my jacket pocket. November 27th, 7 days out. The stage already set, the audience confirmed the evidence all in hand. But today, Barrett and Gavin needed to walk away believing they had won. "I understand," I said quietly. The words tasted of cold steel wrapped in something softer. Barrett's face changed, calculation giving way to satisfaction. "The signing ceremony is set for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. at our corporate counsel's office," he said. "Bring your attorney. We'll finalize the transfer documents and establish the new management structure tomorrow morning, November 21st, 6 days before the gala." I gave a slow nod, wearing the face of a tired old man who had finally stopped pushing back. "I will be at your legal counsel's office tomorrow to execute the signatures," I said. Gavin and Barrett exchanged a look, the kind that moves between two people who believe a hard negotiation has just quietly resolved itself in their favor. The old man had given in. The resistance was behind them. What they failed to see was the gala invitation resting against my chest, dated November 27th, 1 day after their signing ceremony, 1 day before the trust deadline would trigger Grant's layered protections. What they could not know was that the signing ceremony Barrett had arranged was itself the mechanism Grant had designed, an affidavit of interrogation and acknowledgement recording every threat, every demand, every explicit declaration of their intent to seize assets through fraudulent incapacity claims. They believed they were completing their takeover. They were providing documented testimony to their own conspiracy. I rose from the table and accepted the settlement papers Barrett offered me the way a general accepts terms after a battle he has already lost. "Thank you for your patience," I said, the words meaning nothing of what they were taken to mean. Barrett gave the nod of a man who has just picked up a valuable asset at well below its worth. Gavin walked me out to his rental car, his arm finding my shoulders again, performing for anyone who happened to be looking. "You're making the right decision, Dad, Yesu," he said. The gala invitation lay against my ribs, a quiet reminder of what was 7 days away. 7 days until everything they believed they had put safely underground would rise into view in front of national media, business figures, and labor representatives assembled to witness exactly what my son had exchanged his name for. 7 days until what they thought was finished would prove to have barely started. But the countdown moved faster than I had expected. The witnesses Barrett was certain couldn't be reached were already beginning to talk. Serena's breath came out in white puffs in the sub-zero parking structure, her hands unsteady around the encrypted USB drive she had spent 3 days duplicating without Barrett's knowledge. It was 11:47 p.m. on November 22nd. Grant and I stood on the frozen concrete 3 levels below street level, our own breath hanging visible in the November cold. Serena had chosen the location for reasons people have always chosen parking structures for covert meetings. No cameras, no witnesses, just the flat echo of voices off concrete. "I'm sorry it took this long," Serena said, her voice unsteady from the cold, from fear, or from both. "Barrett keeps everything behind encryption. I had to copy the files during the night while he was asleep." She passed the drive to Grant, who connected it to his laptop without hesitation. The glow of the screen lit all 3 of our faces as file directories opened thousands of messages sorted by date and participant. Barrett told Gavin exactly which language would produce the deepest humiliation while staying defensible legally, Serena said, directing us to a chat thread dated November 4th, 2017. "Look at this." Grant opened the file. I read over his shoulder and watched my son's name appear alongside his father-in-law's, the 2 of them working through how to turn my occupation into commercial fuel. Barrett's message was precise in its coldness. The night janitor reference tests extremely well with the target demographic, triggers sympathy for the bootstrapped founder narrative while establishing clear class separation. Legal reviewed no actionable defamation if stated as biographical fact. Maximize the contrast. Gavin's reply came 6 minutes later. "What about blowback from actual family?" Barrett's response managed through incapacity petition if necessary. "We're laying the groundwork now. Every public statement he makes in response becomes evidence of emotional instability triggered by viral stress. The crisis manufactures its own legal justification. They mapped out every insult in advance." Serena continued, the words coming quicker now, urgency overtaking caution. "It was investor theater. Barrett showed Gavin how to turn your financial history into a fundraising instrument, and then how to convert the public humiliation into the basis of an incapacity claim." Grant scrolled on through the messages, his face growing darker with each screen. "This is premeditated conspiracy," he said, keeping his voice low. "Every element laid out in their own words. Indo." Serena pulled her arms tight against the cold. "I won't be part of taking away your civil rights," she said, and looked at me directly for the first time. "Barrett thinks I don't follow legal strategy, but I watched him use the courts to ruin people my whole life. This is what he does. He manufactures crises, then charges for the rescue. Betrayal from blood cuts the deepest, but defection from within their own camp cuts through steel." I took the USB drive from Grant, turning it over in my palm, a few ounces of plastic, and circuit holding the full architecture of how my son had been remade into Barrett's instrument. "Thank you," I said. Nothing more needed saying. Serena was already moving toward her car. She had done what her conscience required, but the fear of what Barrett would do once he discovered it hadn't left her eyes. Her taillights shrank and vanished into the November dark. Grant and I sat in his car for another hour, working through the files, cataloging what would become the exhibit list for the gala. Every chat log, every strategic directive, every deliberate step in the plan to convert family into capital. The following morning, November 23rd, Sylvia's article landed on the front page of Denver's major newspaper, the headline calibrated to set off exactly the kind of conversation we needed. "The Invisible Vanguard. Anonymous millions backing Denver's night shift, labor families." She had built it with care, my identity buried completely, but the foundation's financial scope described with enough detail that anyone paying close attention could follow the trail back to its source. The piece told of a mysterious benefactor who had worked Denver's night shifts for 40 years while quietly assembling a trust to support custodial workers, transit employees, overnight security guards, and their families. No names, no direct nod to Gavin's podcast. Just a story running in parallel that invited the reader to draw the obvious comparison. Sylvia rang me at noon voice taut with reined-in excitement. 4 hours and it's already at 60,000 shares, she said. People are drawing lines between the podcast insults and the foundation timeline. By that evening, social media had made those lines explicit. Comment threads filled up with people setting Gavin's mockery of his night janitor father side by side with the anonymous foundation built to serve night shift workers. The national conversation had moved from celebrity podcast drama to something with more weight: corporate gain against working-class dignity children who erase where they came from against those who find a way to honor it. The foundation's existence was now out in the open, even with my name still shielded. Barrett's team would have tracked the article, cross-checked the financial disclosures, satisfied themselves that the vulnerable assets they intended to seize at the Gala were real. Grant's secure server caught Barrett's reply at 8:34 p.m. The threatening email burned on his laptop screen, the message absolute in its miscalculation. If you claim association with this fund at the Gala, we will destroy you as a fraud who faked poverty. How do you threaten a man with exposure when his poverty was never invented? Only his wealth had been kept out of sight. Grant read the email a second time, then moved it to the evidence folder with a note attached. Written acknowledgement that respondent controls foundation assets. Direct contradiction to incapacity claims filed November 11th. Subject line: extortion threat and admission of awareness. That single message achieved what weeks of depositions might have failed to deliver. Barrett's legal team had put into writing that they knew I controlled the foundation, the same foundation whose very existence demonstrated that I had the cognitive capacity and long-range planning ability to build and sustain complex financial structures across 40 years. Their own threat dismantled every sworn claim in their incapacity petition. They just handed you the last piece, Grant said, shutting his laptop. Written proof that they know you're sharp enough to control millions, sent the same week they're swearing in court that you're too impaired to manage your own affairs. 4 days to the Gala, November 27th. The stage set, the audience confirmed the evidence assembled into packages ready for distribution to every media outlet, every business leader, every labor representative in that room. Barrett thought he was sending a warning. What he had actually done was supply written confirmation that his entire legal campaign rested on claims he knew to be false. 4 days until the precision this required could finally be applied. 4 days until everything they had worked to bury would break the surface in front of 300 witnesses who would carry the truth well past any courtroom, any legal stratagem, any crisis Barrett could manufacture, and then offer to resolve for a fee. The final piece of evidence sat in Grant's secure server, time-stamped and permanent. That precision began with Devin Crane's courage and ended with my final night shift. The two ends of 40 years compressed into 72 hours. The archive warehouse carried the smell of decaying paper and broken promises, exactly the kind of place Devin Crane had chosen to detonate his non-disclosure agreement. November 24th. Grant Arthur Norris and I met Devin in the same warehouse where he and Gavin had once stored the paperwork from their first startup, back when they still remembered what it felt like to struggle. The space was unchanged. Concrete floors, metal shelving, rows of cardboard boxes holding contracts nobody would ever open again. That particular mustiness of documents forgotten on purpose. Devin looked different from the man I had met at the diner. Sylvia's article had done something to him, burned off the fear, and left a harder thing underneath. Gavin rehearsed the poverty narrative 47 times before the Series A pitch. Devin said, spreading the original investor pitch decks across a dusty table. 47 practice runs. I sat through them. He worked the inflection, the pause before he brought up his struggling night janitor father, the precise catch in his voice that made investors lean forward. Arthur Norris arranged his notary equipment, preparing to witness what would become sworn testimony. Devin pulled out investor correspondence emails, term sheets, internal memos, laying out in exact detail how Gavin had constructed his origin story. He told investors his father was struggling. Destitute Devin continued his voice level now, whatever hesitation had lived in him before burned away by the national conversation Sylvia's article had ignited. All while keeping his father blocked from family communications, making sure the struggling father stayed conveniently out of reach and unable to contradict the story being told about him. The unredacted correspondence showed systematic fraud spanning 3 years. Gavin marketing himself as the bootstrapped founder who understood working-class hardship, building investor sympathy on the foundation of his father's genuine poverty, then pivoting to old money, Wyndham branding the moment Serena's family capital became available, committing fraud for quarterly earnings. Devon said, signing the sworn affidavit as Arthur pressed his witness seal beside the signature. How many lies does it take to build a billion-dollar valuation on the back of your father's authentic suffering? 47 rehearsals, apparently. 47 calculated performances in which my son converted genuine hardship into a commercial asset, then discarded the source once it had served its purpose. But Barrett was not done. On November 25th, his legal team made one final lunge to stop what was bearing down on them. Grant and I sat in Judge Harriet Elwood's emergency chambers while Diana Colton argued that the Foundation Gala should be legally shut down. Judge Elwood, emergency chambers magistrate with 15 years adjudicating corporate disputes, listened with the measured expression of someone who had heard every permutation of legal pressure tactics. This event constitutes premeditated corporate defamation engineered by a mentally incompetent individual, Diana argued, her voice carrying the assurance of someone accustomed to winning through force of position. We respectfully request an immediate temporary restraining order preventing the November 27th gathering. Grant rose and set 2 documents on the judge's bench with deliberate quiet. Dr. Foxworth's neurological assessment confirms perfect cognitive function as of November 18th, he said, certified by a court-appointed independent specialist. Additionally, the Foundation operates under independent corporate bylaws filed with the state 3 weeks ago. Petitioners' incapacity claims are directly contradicted by their own threatening communications in which they explicitly acknowledge respondents' control of Foundation assets. Judge Elwood reviewed the documents: Dr. Foxworth's evaluation, the Foundation's legal structure, Barrett's threatening email which Grant had filed as evidence that Barrett knew full well I possessed complete cognitive capacity. She looked up, expression giving nothing away, but her voice left no room. Motion denied, Judge Elwood said. The Foundation operates under independent bylaws. Petitioner has demonstrated no standing to interfere with a legally constituted charitable organization's public event. Furthermore, the medical evidence directly contradicts claims of incompetence. Diana moved to object, but Judge Elwood was already closing the file. The legal path was open. November 27th would go forward exactly as planned. That night, November 26th, I returned to Denver's transit hub for the last time. My final shift. 11:40 p.m. The terminal had gone quiet, most travelers long since home or tucked into hotel rooms. Only the overnight workers remained, the invisible ones who kept the city moving while everyone else slept. I guided my motorized floor polisher across the main concourse, working the winter grime from tiles I had cleaned thousands of times. My hands understood every inch of this floor, every subtle change in grade, every worn patch that needed more care. This floor has witnessed more dignity than any boardroom ever will, I said quietly, watching my own reflection track across the polished surface. 40 years of invisible labor that built something permanent while my son built something hollow, the difference between a foundation and a facade. I finished the last section at 11:58 p.m. and returned my equipment to storage for the final time. Lenora and Cedric were on the north wing. I had already said my private goodbyes to them earlier in the week, let them know that tomorrow night would change everything. The mop handle felt like something close to sacred, 40 years of honest work condensed into a single last stroke. I pulled out my encrypted phone and sent Sylvia the message we had settled on. Tomorrow night I step onto that stage, I typed. But remember, this story must never be about me. It belongs entirely to every soul working after midnight. 3 words came back without delay. Understood. The evidence speaks for itself. I was standing at the heart of Glenwood Terminal, taking in the vast hall I'd given 4 decades of my life to. Thousands of commuters had moved through this place without once registering my existence. Every one of them counting on labor performed in the shadows so their own journeys could unfold in comfort. The clock tower overhead rang out midnight. November 27th. 2 days left before the November 28th trust deadline, 2 days before the mechanism Hazel and I had so carefully constructed would fire, sealing the capital away permanently for the families it was meant to serve. Every legal wall Barrett had tried to build around himself had since crumbled. Dr. Foxworth's evaluation had gutted the incapacity petition. Judge Elwood had turned away the emergency injunction. Barrett's own threatening message now sat in the record as documentary proof he understood perfectly well that my mind was intact. My encrypted transmission to Sylvia had gone out, final instructions delivered, and gone. One more night, and the Foundation Gala would shed its charity event disguise and become something else entirely, a public reckoning. 300 witnesses, executives, labor voices, national press, every one of them about to see the full body of evidence Grant and I had put together. Devin's affidavit, Serena's chat logs, Gavin's written approval, Barrett's notarized threats, Arthur Norris's certified account of the November 21st signing ceremony, a complete evidentiary record verified and ready to deploy. Barrett, meanwhile, still walked around believing he was headed into a standard corporate cleanup operation. He still took the foundation transfer I'd left in plain sight as the weak point he could press. He had no notion the jaws had already closed around him. The Gala would need the precision of a field operation and timing that could not slip. But I had spent 40 years getting here. 40 years of quiet preparation, all of it converging the moment I stepped through the doors of Meridian Concert Hall and found 300 faces looking back at me, none of them yet grasping what kind of evening this would be. The chandeliers hung overhead, their light cold and deliberate. 7 p.m. Meridian. Concert Hall's ballroom held Denver's corporate leadership union delegates and a national press contingent that Grant had hand-selected and personally brought in. I took my place at the foundation table up near the front. Grant was at my side, laptop open, its feed running to the massive LED screen suspended above the stage. Barrett and Gavin had the VIP table. I had sent their invitations myself, the best seats in the house for their own unmasking. Serena sat next to Gavin, her face wearing the look of someone who had already made peace with what was about to happen. She knew. They did not. The air in that ballroom carried expensive scent and the warmth of catered food, the comfortable atmosphere of wealth, gathering to congratulate itself on its generosity toward the workers it had never once looked at directly. Tonight, those workers would not be invisible. Before the evening's formal proceedings could get underway, Barrett pushed back his chair and made for the stage, moving the way men move when they have never once been told to sit down. A brief word with the event coordinator, a practice gesture in Gavin's direction. Donor tier access bought in advance for exactly this purpose. Barrett had put his son at the podium ahead of me, precisely the play Grant and I had mapped out and prepared for. Gavin mounted the stage at 7:05 p.m. and settled behind the lectern with the composed authority he usually saved for pitching investors. 300 people fell quiet, every face in the room orienting toward my son as he began to run Barrett's script. We celebrate charity tonight. Gavin opened his tone, wrapped in the kind of warmth that only professional media coaching produces. But we must also address my father's declining mental health with grace. Each word was a shaped charge placed to blow apart my standing before I'd drawn a breath to speak. I publicly forgive him for the erratic actions cognitive decline can cause. He went on, the delivery calibrated for maximum compassionate effect. The stress of viral attention, the confusion about complex financial matters, these are symptoms we must treat with patience and professional care. It was Barrett's incapacity, playbook performed live, the loving son stepping in to guard a diminished father from the consequences of his own unraveling mind. Preemptive control of the room's narrative, 300 witnesses locked in before I could say a word. Our family will ensure he receives the professional care he deserves. Gavin finished, turning his eyes directly to me with a look of concern so practiced it might have read as genuine to anyone in that ballroom who lacked our knowledge. I gave him nothing in return, no movement, no reaction, and let the curtain fall on his performance. Grant's fingers rested easy on the keyboard, poised for the moment. What does forgiveness actually cost when the microphone was taken before the forgiven could speak? Gavin stepped off the stage and back to his seat, collecting a round of polite applause from people who believed they'd just seen a son show uncommon grace toward a struggling father. Barrett's nod of approval was almost imperceptible. The opening move had hit its mark. He had been dealt with. The old man handled before he could make a scene. Then Grant rose and walked to the podium at the unhurried pace of a lawyer who has already won. "Thank you for joining us for the Invisible Vanguard Foundation's inaugural gala," he said, his tone carrying the cool neutrality of someone reading into the record rather than addressing a crowd. Before tonight's program begins, I want to offer some background on how this foundation came into being. One keystroke. The LED screen blazed to life behind him, throwing up a document heading Internal Communication, November 6, 2017. The low hum of after-speech conversation dropped away to nothing. "Exhibit A," Grant said. "November 6th, Internal Communication, verified corporate digital signature." Gavin's email went up on that screen at a size no one in the room could pretend they couldn't read. Corporate letterhead timestamp authenticated signature, every element confirmed. Airtight, from Gavin Wyndham to Apex Brand Solutions. Subject podcast final cut approval. Date November 6th, 2017, 3:47 p.m. The directive reads, Grant said, his voice moving through the silence the way a blade moves through resistance. Leave the night janitor reference in. It creates perfect friction narrative. It's exactly the personal brand evolution that scales. Not a sound from the room. 300 people held still while Gavin's own typed words demonstrated that what had been done to his father was never an accident, never improvised banter. It had been a strategy ratified on paper 3 days before the microphone ever opened. I watched the blood leave Gavin's face. I watched Barrett's satisfaction dissolve into something raw fury bleeding into fear. Serena shut her eyes as though keeping them open was no longer something she could manage. The metadata timestamp, Grant said, clicking to the next slide and its technical verification layer, establishes that this directive preceded the broadcast by 3 days. This was not a reaction to anything. This was premeditated brand strategy of father's humiliation converted into a commercial asset. 300 witnesses, 1 verified signature. No exits. The screen held every thread of technical evidence, authentication records, corporate email routing, server data, metadata, tracing the message back without ambiguity to Gavin's own verified account. Forgery was not a story anyone could tell here. My son had put his name on the decision to use his father's degradation as a business tool in writing through official channels, and those communications would now travel into every courtroom filing, every press story, every national discussion about the foundations of Gavin Wyndham's career. Grant left it on screen for 15 seconds, unhurried, letting 300 sets of eyes do the work. Then the slide changed. Now let us turn to the question of what this brand strategy was engineered to take. Grant said, cursor settling above the financial documents that would draw the direct line between Gavin's emotional exploitation and the money behind it. The November 6th timestamp burned cold in the projection light. Gavin's corporate signature was embedding itself in the memory of every executive union delegate and journalist in that hall, people who would move this story into places no amount of Barrett's legal spending could reach. The financial picture would turn moral revulsion into criminal exposure, and Grant's cursor was already moving there. He advanced to the next slide. The screen filled with a scanned page, its margins browned at the edges with the passage of years. December 2008. Grant said, his voice clear across the silent room. The Harwick Family Integrity Trust, established by Harold Alden Harwick with explicit parameters governing inheritance eligibility. From my position along the kitchen corridor wall, I had a clear line of sight to Gavin's face. What I saw there was a man watching a door seal shut. Section 4, subsection C. Grant continued, laser pointer tracing the relevant text. Beneficiary status shall be contingent upon maintenance of family surname and demonstrated adherence to principles of honor, integrity, and familial respect. Any heir who willfully abandons the family name or engages in public disparagement of the trust shall be deemed to have voluntarily forfeited all inheritance rights effective immediately upon such action. The room broke open. Reporters pressed forward from the back. Camera flashes strobed across the stricken faces at the head table. Gavin Wyndham. Grant said, each word placed like a stone, legally changed his surname from Harwick to Wyndham on March 17, 2016. That act, taken together with the documented public humiliation of his father on September 28, 2018, triggered automatic disqualification under trust parameters his grandfather had set in place a full decade prior. Barrett was already on his feet, but Grant raised his voice over the objection before it could form. The trust deed contains no provision for appeal, no mechanism for reinstatement. Gavin Wyndham inherited nothing because by the time of activation he had already chosen to sever every legal and ethical connection the trust was designed to protect. Something unfamiliar moved through my chest, not quite satisfaction, something quieter than that. The recognition that I had built the protection in long before I ever understood I would need it. He committed inheritance suicide. Someone nearby breathed it aloud. The phrase moved through the crowd like a current. Gavin shoved back from his chair, which clattered behind him. This is a fabrication. My father was mentally incompetent when... Which brings us... Grant cut in without raising his voice to the second exhibit. The screen shifted. November 21st, 2017. A document executed before Arthur Norris licensed notary public with Raymond Hewitt of Peaton Wealth Management as witness. I knew the form the instant I saw it, the settlement agreement Barrett had compelled me to put my name to at the dining club. Affidavit of Corporate Interrogation and Acknowledgement, Grant read from the header. Let me walk through several relevant sections. The screen now carried Barrett's words in verbatim transcript. You will sign this agreement today, or my client will initiate legal action that will consume every asset you possess. We have evidence of fraudulent trust manipulation, and we will deploy it through every available channel. Grant advanced to the next passage. If you contest this settlement in any form, we will ensure your employer terminates your position. We will freeze every account. We will make certain you die as destitute as you lived. The ballroom held this kind of silence that only arrives when a room full of people is processing something it cannot quite believe. Even the reporters had gone still. My client's reputation is worth more than your entire existence. Sign now or learn exactly how thoroughly we can dismantle the legal fiction you've constructed. Grant looked up from the screen directly at Barrett, whose color had drained away. Every threat notarized and witnessed, every extortion attempt documented under penalty of perjury. He gestured toward the projection. Mr. Thornton's firm specializes in asset protection litigation. They have represented corporate executives in 43 states, and this represents the most comprehensively documented extortion attempt in their institutional history. I watched Barrett seize his briefcase and angle toward the exit. He hadn't managed 3 steps before a figure near the back of the room stood up. Serena Wyndham. She had on a navy suit, dark hair drawn back without softness. She bore no resemblance to the rattled associate I'd glimpsed outside Barrett's office building. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice did not waver. "I have something to add to this record." Every head in the room turned. Barrett went rigid mid-stride. Serena moved toward the microphone, her heels sharp against the polished floor. Grant stepped aside without a word, as though her appearance had always been part of the program. "My name is Serena Wyndham," she said into the microphone. "Until 4 days ago, I was a junior associate at Saxon & Rothstein, LLP. I worked directly under Barrett Saxon on the Harwick matter." Barrett's expression moved through panic and landed somewhere colder, more calculated. "I have in my possession," Serena continued, drawing a flash drive from her pocket and holding it up, "encrypted chat logs, billing records, and internal strategy documents that provide context for everything you've witnessed tonight, including communications discussing the deliberate fabrication of evidence, planned witness intimidation, and Barrett's personal knowledge that every legal threat he made against Harold Harwick was built on claims he knew to be false." The room came apart. Reporters fired questions across each other. Barrett drove toward the exit, but 2 men I recognized from Diana Colton's firm had already settled into the doorway. Gavin stood at the head table without moving, his face emptied of everything. Serena looked across the room and found me for the first time. Something passed between us in that moment. Not an apology exactly, more like mutual recognition. One person who had found the nerve to step clear of his shadow meeting another who had already done the same. "Mr. Grant," she said, turning back, "I'm prepared to provide sworn testimony regarding the full scope of the Saxon legal strategy, including evidence that may be relevant to Bar Association ethics proceedings. Is this venue appropriate, or should I coordinate with your office?" Grant's expression stayed professionally neutral, but I caught the satisfaction underneath it. "I believe everyone present would benefit from your testimony. Ms. Saxon, please continue." Serena gripped the microphone with both hands, steadying herself against what she was carrying. Camera flashes ran together into a continuous strobe across her face. I could see her jaw working. "I need to provide context," she said, her voice steadier than her body language suggested it would be. "For the past 18 months, I worked under Barrett Saxon documenting the Saxon legal strategy. What I witnessed was not advocacy. It was systematic manipulation, a father weaponizing his own son." The ballroom went absolutely still. "Barrett wrote every word of that forgiveness speech," Serena continued. "Gavin was delivering his father's script. I have text archives that establish explicit directives." She raised her phone and projected messages onto the screen behind her. "November 18th, 8:47 a.m. Position yourself as compassionate son protecting senile father. Manufacture emotional credibility. Investors value narrative control." I watched Gavin stare at the screen, then stare at Barrett, confusion curdling into something that had no clean name. Serena moved to another message. November 19th. The podcast humiliation was necessary foundation. You converted poverty into brand differentiation. Now convert concern into inheritance access. This is basic investor psychology. "Stop!" Barrett's voice came out tight. "You are violating attorney-client." "I was never Gavin's attorney," Serena interrupted. I was yours, and these communications document your personal strategy to manipulate your own son into dismantling his relationship with his father for asset acquisition purposes you designed. The force of it hit the room like something physical. Barrett had engineered all of it: the podcast, the public humiliation, the forgiveness, speech delivered under hot lights. Gavin had been performing lines his father had written for him. "You are dead to this family," Barrett shouted, his professional composure finally giving way entirely. "You have ruined everything we built." "You built nothing," Serena said, her voice quiet and level. "You built a fraud on top of a son who trusted you." She stepped back from the microphone. Grant moved to escort her toward our table where legal protection was waiting. I felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes find me. The kitchen corridor I'd occupied all evening suddenly felt like another lifetime. Grant gestured toward the microphone. "Mr. Harwick, would you like to address the assembly?" I had not planned to speak. 40 years of silence held together by dignity, and now 3 sentences would break it open. But I walked toward the center of the stage, my clean suit sitting strangely on skin more familiar with a dark gray work uniform. The microphone felt cold when I touched it. The ballroom carried expensive cologne and the sharp new scent of panic. "My name is Harold Alden Harwick," I said, my voice held steadier than I had any right to expect. "I am 68 years old. For the past 40 years I have worked night maintenance at Summit Ridge Center, and I have never been poor." The silence that followed had a confused quality to it. "In December 2008, I established a $38 million trust as a promise to my late wife. She believed wealth should only lift up the people who keep this city running after midnight. Janitors, security guards, overnight nurses, people whose work disappears the moment daylight arrives." I looked directly at Gavin. He was gripping the table-edged knuckles white against the linen. "I chose to live as a custodian because dignity is not measured in bank statements," I continued. "My wife understood that. She made me promise to use our combined inheritance to build something that would outlast us both. A foundation funding education, healthcare, housing, but only for working people. Never for hedge fund executives, never for venture capital consultants, never for sons who convert their fathers into inventory." The room was completely still, not even the reporters moved. "A name is not a brand to be optimized, son," I said, keeping my voice low, unhurried. "You did not insult me on that podcast. You converted your own father into cheap inventory to sell to a room full of men who measure human worth in capital allocation efficiency." I reached into my jacket pocket and drew out a folded document. "This is a formal offer. You can reclaim the name Harwick and rebuild your relationship with truth. Or you can maintain the Wyndham facade and inherit exactly what you have already chosen. A world of illusions where your father wrote your forgiveness speech and your credibility ended on a stage in front of 300 witnesses." I placed the document on the podium and stepped back. Gavin sat frozen, mouth slightly open. Behind him, Barrett was already moving for the exit briefcase locked in his grip. Then Devin Crane stood, the co-founder I had met in the parking garage. He walked without hurry to the press table and placed a thick folder in front of a reporter wearing a Wall Street Journal credential. "Full fraud file," Devin said, his voice reaching every corner of the ballroom. 3 years of fraudulent capitalization misrepresentations. Gavin Wyndham assembled his entire startup valuation from manufactured metrics and fabricated social capital. Every institutional investor seated in this room purchased a brand narrative constructed on poverty that was never real. The crowd fractured. Reporters pushed toward the front. Camera flashes hammered the room in a relentless pulse. What remains of a man once he has cashed out his father, his name, and his integrity for a fabrication? I watched the answer materialize before me. Barry Thornton, 62 years old, lead institutional venture capitalist at Elevation Partners, pushed back his chair and rose from the VIP section with slow, deliberate weight. He fastened the button on his jacket, turned, walked for the door without uttering a syllable. 3 colleagues rose at once and fell in behind him, then 6 more, then 12. Thornton held at the threshold just long enough to cast one look back at Gavin. "We back real numbers, kid," he said, his tone stripped of any warmth. "Not operators who turn their own fathers into product." The departure fed on itself. Inside 90 seconds, every significant institutional investor had cleared out. Gavin's phone erupted. Alert after alert strobed across the screen without stopping. Board investigation flags, investor withdrawal notices, legal hold orders. He sat staring at his own hands, the hands that had executed the name change paperwork, absorbed Barrett's instructions, handed the podcast its storyline. His corporate device kept piling up demands he had no answer for. "What have I done?" The words escaped him in barely a whisper. The microphone picked them up and sent them across the emptying hall. What have I completely thrown away? From the podium, I watched my son absorb the full arithmetic of the decisions he had made. Across the thinning room, Serena sat at Grant's side, her part in the evening finished. Grant organized his materials with quiet efficiency, already thinking ahead to what the morning would require. The path forward offered two destinations: a chance at rebuilding something real, or the long slide into complete ruin. For the first time in 4 decades, navigation of that fork fell entirely to my son. The corridor behind the ballroom stage was poorly lit, smelling of old concrete and paint that predated both of us. I was barely down the passage when I heard feet slapping the floor at a run, then the broken sound of someone crying hard enough to lose their breath, the echo bouncing off bare block walls. "Dad, please." Gavin caught me just before the loading dock, his voice ragged. His face was swollen and red. His jacket had come loose at one shoulder. "Please, you have to forgive me. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them none of this was intentional." I turned around. His hands couldn't hold still. "Answer me one thing honestly," I said, keeping my voice level. "If that $38 million didn't exist, if the trust held nothing, would you walk away from Wyndham and take back the name Harwick tonight?" His mouth opened, then stopped. His gaze slid sideways, running the numbers. "The optics would need careful handling," he said at last. "Any name transition carries brand risk. Investor sentiment requires—" "Stop." One word. He actually shifted backward from it. "You haven't stopped," I said. "Even standing here with everything you built collapsing behind you, you're still performing a cost-benefit calculation on whether real contrition improves your positioning." "That isn't fair," he breathed. "I mean what I'm saying. I came tonight to apologize. I came to fix this." "You came to contain it," I said. "There is a distance between genuine remorse and strategic damage limitation, son. The first one changes who you are. The second simply recoats the same calculation that walked you into this corridor tonight." His composure was visibly cracking, both fists opening and closing against his thighs. "Then what do I have to do?" he said, the steadiness gone from his voice entirely. "Just tell me. Hand me the instructions. I will follow them precisely." "How do you extend forgiveness to a man still tabulating the return on his apology?" I looked at him, 34 years old, Stanford, MBA, the venture world's celebrated prodigy, standing on bare concrete, asking for something he hadn't managed to stop pricing. "An apology you've run through a spreadsheet is just another transaction," I said. "Real remorse doesn't announce itself. It walks a hard road over a long time quietly without an audience." He moved toward me. I moved back. "I need to sit with this," I said. "And you need to spend some time finding out whether truth is something you can choose when strategy points the other way." I walked away from him. His sobbing chased me down walls that had soaked up 40 years of my middle-of-the-night work. The loading dock door took my weight and shut behind me with a deep metallic boom. Grant's car sat idling at the curb. We moved through the hollow Denver streets without exchanging a word, heading for his office. By the morning of November 28th, I was sitting across from Grant at his mahogany desk. The room held the smell of old leather and older paper. Through the glass, the early sun drew hard lines across the downtown skyline where night janitors were wrapping up their final rounds. "The structural reallocation is ready for execution," Grant said, advancing a set of documents across to me. "This formalizes Gavin's status as temporarily suspended from all lineage benefits due to willful dishonor." I worked through the language one clause at a time. Legal precision had always been something I respected. "Temporarily," I said. "You built in a pathway." 12 months, Grant confirmed. "Concrete verifiable actions, nothing performative. Meet the requirements by November 28, 2019, and his standing comes back." The architecture was intentional. I wasn't cutting my son off. I was extending something far more demanding than rejection, true accountability with real stakes on one side and genuine restoration on the other. "The primary trust capital," I said. "Permanently sealed away from any corporate reach," Grant said. "Locked entirely to fund the Night Shift Community Foundation, regardless of what Gavin chooses to do. Those assets go where your wife always meant them to go. Janitors, security guards, overnight nurses, the people whose labor the world pretends not to notice once the sun comes up." I signed with a pen that had belonged to Grant's grandfather, the one he had used to establish the firm in 1947. The weight of it was not lost on me. "The honor restoration pathway conditions," Grant said, drawing a heavy, wax-sealed cream envelope bearing her family crest, a river stone bridge, flanked by twin willows from the drawer. Specific measurable commitments, public community service, financial transparency audits, legal restoration of the birth name Harwick, 12 months of choices that won't be photographed or packaged for anyone. He laid the envelope between us on the desk. He has to hunger for the change more than he hungers for the money, I said. That's what the conditions are built to test, Grant said. No shortcut exists. No communications team engineers their way through this. He either becomes someone different or he demonstrates that he can't. I rested my fingers on the envelope. The paper was heavy and smooth against skin that had known rougher textures for most of its life. Somewhere inside that seal was either the beginning of my son's recovery or the definitive confirmation that certain men will always choose a comfortable illusion over a hard truth. Redemption doesn't travel by press release. It travels on foot over 12 months of choices no one is watching. Take this to his door, I said, moving the envelope toward Grant's side of the desk. Then we find out what he decides when there's no audience. Grant lifted it with 2 hands, treating it accordingly. If he walks away from it, I said, the foundation carries on serving people who never stopped showing up for their work. And my son learns what I already knew. There are things that can't be gamed into your possession, only grown into. I got up. Summit Ridge Center was framed in Grant's window across the distance. 11 hours until my shift. The floors waited for no one. The deadline holds without exception, Grant said, marking his legal pad. November 28, 2019. 365 days to answer the question of who he actually is. Forward me the foundation charter when it's ready, I said. I want to look at how the distributions are structured before anything goes public. Grant nodded. There's one signature remaining, the formal transfer establishing foundation governance. I'll have that prepared for next week. I shook his hand. Solid, unhurried grip. Outside Denver was waking up, traffic starting to thicken toward the morning rush. Somewhere above the city in a glass apartment, my son was almost certainly sitting amid the rubble of his phone, working out how to manage what was left. In 12 months, we would find out whether he had taught himself to work out something worth more than that. Grant still held the sealed envelope, the last real chance I was giving my son. The November 2019 deadline existed in legal language now permanent and unambiguous. What those pages carried was a father's careful, measured offer, not absolution, but the architecture of earning it through a year of actions too quiet to spin and too real to fake. Grant rang me 3 hours after he'd made the delivery. The wax seal had split cleanly under Gavin's thumbnail. Grant told me my son had gone through all 4 conditions twice before he said anything. I had chosen those conditions with care. Not to inflict pain, but to take apart the constructed version of himself layer by layer until what was underneath, if anything genuine was there, could finally be seen. Condition 1, a public unedited, written apology distributed across every media platform where the original humiliation had aired. 0 PR involvement, 0 messaging strategy, a plain acknowledgement of deliberate cruelty deployed for investor optics. Condition 2, legal restoration of the birth name, Harwick, on every official document that existed. Driver's license, business filings, every professional record where the Wyndham rebrand had cut the family thread. Condition 3, 1 uninterrupted calendar year of unpaid manual service for the foundation, exclusively on the overnight shift at Glenwood Terminal. The same surfaces I'd worked for 40 years, the same hours that only people who have lived them truly understand. Condition 4, full restitution of all stolen equity and back pay to Devin Crane. The co-founder Gavin had methodically erased from the corporate record and the cap table. Grant had relayed that Serena was present when Gavin read through the document. She had gone pale at condition 3. They want you scrubbing floors like your father for 12 months, she had said. Gavin hadn't answered right away. He'd moved to the window of their apartment. They had relocated from the high-rise to a modest leased unit in Whittier after the investor funds evaporated. The view was ordinary street traffic now, not mountain panoramas. If I'm ever going to find out who I actually am, Gavin had said, at last his voice low and unhurried, I have to start on the floor tonight. Grant passed this along to me over bitter coffee in his office. I sat with the acidity of it on my tongue while I turned my son's answer over in my mind. 12 months of midnight floors, the precise sentence I had chosen for myself freely over 40 years. The distinction was that I had never required redemption. I had simply grasped early that dignity lived inside honest work rather than manufactured prestige. Gavin would have to arrive at that truth through blistered palms and worn-down shoulders in the deep, unremarkable anonymity of cleaning rooms while the rest of the city slept. He asked when he should start, Grant said. I told him December 2nd. That gives him 4 days to file the legal name change reversal and get the public apology drafted. I gave a single nod. 4 days was tight but workable. Either my son was genuinely committed to the change or he would collapse in the first week and answer the question of whether he was capable of it. December 2nd arrived on a breath of early winter cold. I was getting ready for my own shift when Grant sent a link to a private live stream. Barrett Wyndham's corporate board had convened an emergency session. I pulled it up on my phone in the Summit Ridge Center break room. 12 board members filled a video conference grid, their expressions professionally unreadable. Barrett sat at the center, his face already braced for combat. This narrative is a fabricated smear campaign by a bitter family member seeking vindictive, he began. A board member cut across him. I recognized the voice, Caroline Hartwell, general counsel for the firm's largest institutional investor. We have a certified notarized affidavit, Barrett, she said, documenting your explicit extortion demands executed before a licensed notary witnessed by a trust officer from Peton Wealth Management. Arthur Norris has confirmed the document's authenticity under penalty of perjury. Barrett's face locked up. The context of that document, the context is unambiguous. Another board member cut in. You threatened a 68-year-old janitor with financial destruction unless he signed over assets your client had already disqualified himself from inheriting. You built a systematic fraud. You turned your own son into an instrument for asset acquisition. The vote ran 12 minutes. Unanimous strip Barrett of his chairman's seat and sever all capital relations with his fund entirely. How does the prestige of old money sound when 12 votes erase it? In 12 minutes, I watched Barrett's square go dark as he dropped off the call. The board carried on without him, already moving to transition protocols and messaging strategy. 40 years of reputation engineered layer by layer, taken apart in the time it takes to work through 3 office suites. I switched off my phone and began my shift. Section C needed attention. Someone had spilled coffee near the elevator bank and the sour smell of old espresso had settled into the corridor. Later that night, Grant sent a photograph. Gavin standing before a bathroom mirror in a dark gray work uniform, the fabric stiff and new-looking across his shoulders. His face gave nothing away. The message beneath the image read, Serena took this. He asked her to document the first night not for social media, for himself. His shift starts in 20 minutes. I stayed with the photograph for a long moment. My son looked younger without the tailored suits and the strategic posture stripped of all of it. He looked like the boy who used to help me haul groceries up apartment stairs before business school taught him to reduce human connection to transactional variables. I didn't respond to Grant's message. There wasn't a word that would have fit. Instead, I finished the work. Section C done, emptied trash receptacles from the executive suite, restocked paper towels in the third-floor restrooms. Familiar ground. Honest work. The sort that asks nothing of you but presence and effort. No performance required, no audience needed. Somewhere across Denver, my son was beginning the same education mop and hand bucket at his side, no lens capturing his progress for anyone's pitch deck. The foundation transfer document sat waiting on Grant's desk for a final signature. One remaining formality to ensure the wealth built on a lifetime of dignity would now flow to those who had always understood its true weight. But tonight, the signature that mattered most was the one Gavin made by showing up 33 minutes before midnight on December 2nd in work clothes rather than cashmere, choosing actual labor over calculated appearances. I had no way of knowing whether he would hold for 12 months. I didn't know yet if real change was something he could sustain. But for the first time since that podcast had aired, something resembling cautious hope moved through me. Gavin had fastened that uniform and walked out his front door. Glenwood Terminal's floors were waiting for him, the same floors that had been my silent teachers for 4 decades, the ones that had shown me everything I needed to understand about human worth and the dignity of invisible labor. Now they would work on my son. And unlike anything Stanford's MBA program offered, this curriculum couldn't be purchased, gamed, or leveraged into a competitive advantage. It could only be earned one midnight shift at a time. The cold limestone concourse at Glenwood Terminal hummed with the mechanical vibration of the motorized floor polisher. I watched my son grip the heavy steel frame with hands that were already blistering at 90 minutes in. December 3rd, 1:20 in the morning, his first real shift. A businessman in a costly overcoat moved past Gavin without a glance. Then a nurse heading home off a double. Then a college student with headphones pulled tight. 12 people crossed the concourse in 5 minutes and not one registered my son's face. Total invisibility. The same invisibility I had carried like a second skin for 40 years. Gavin lurched as the polisher caught an uneven seam in the floor. The machine ran 80 pounds dry, closer to 120 with a full solution tank. Whatever conditioning his gym membership had built wasn't designed for industrial equipment that demands endurance over form. I walked across the concourse with a spray bottle and a folded cloth. When I reached him, I gestured toward the floor near the ticket counter. "Missed a patch there?" I said, keeping my voice down. "Oil about 3 feet to your left." He looked nodded. No pushback, no justification. He worked the polisher back around to cover the spot. Lenora, the veteran overnight custodian who had worked this terminal for 16 years, materialized from the east corridor with 2 paper cups of hot coffee. She handed one to me, then crossed toward Gavin. "What's your name, kid?" she said, extending the second cup. Gavin straightened slowly, the effort visible in his lower back. He looked at the cup, then at Lenora's face, then across at me, standing 30 feet off. "My name," he said, his voice holding steady in spite of the exhaustion underneath it. "My name is Gavin," Lenora smiled. "Well, Gavin, you're ahead of most first-nighters already. Bend your knees when you push or your back will be done with you before sunrise." She moved off towards the east platform. Gavin lifted the cup and took a mouthful. Bitter, strong, nothing resembling the artisanal espresso that had accompanied his venture capital meetings. I saw him wince at the taste, then drink again. You wonder how long it takes to learn invisibility. 1 shift, 1 week, 40 years. 7 days on, I stood in the shadow just outside the Foundation's Educational Center community room. Through the open doorway, I could see 40 people in folding chairs, janitors, security guards, overnight nurses, and the teenagers who would receive the first round of scholarships. Sylvia Kent was in the front row, her recording equipment dark. This wasn't a moment for viral metrics. Gavin walked to the small podium. No handlers flanking him, no corporate language prepared in advance. His hands still carried the week's calluses. "Good evening," he said into the microphone. "My name is Gavin Harwick, and I proudly bear the surname of my father." Complete silence settled over the room. "These scholarships honor the families who keep this city moving after midnight," he continued. "People whose labor disappears from sight the moment the sun rises. People whose dignity I failed to recognize until I stood where they stand." He paused, his eyes resting on the teenagers seated in the 3rd row. "No explanations, no excuses, just the name I should never have left behind, and a commitment to make sure your education is never held hostage by people who measure human worth in capital allocation efficiency." I felt something blur at the edges of my vision. My expression held, but something deep in my chest went slack, a release of tension I hadn't noticed I'd been carrying. 40 years of keeping a promise to my wife, and now my son standing in a room beginning to understand what that promise had meant. He read the first scholarship recipient's name aloud, a 17-year-old girl whose mother cleaned office buildings in the financial district. She walked forward with tears moving freely down her face. Full tuition to community college, plus a housing stipend, plus an emergency family support fund. 12 more names called. 12 more futures made possible. January 5th arrived on a wave of bitter cold. 2 in the morning. The platform thermometer read 18 degrees. My breath hung visible in the cold air as I worked the trash receptacles near Track 7. Gavin was 30 feet off, running a parallel unit with a rhythm that had grown steady over the past weeks. 1 month behind us, 11 to go. His hands had toughened his movements, shed their early waste, and the shame that had bent his shoulders in December had quietly become something else. Focus. Purpose. A young commuter waiting on the late Amtrak glanced our way, then returned to his phone. We had become part of the terminal's furniture present, but Unremarkable noticed only if something broke. I walked over to where Gavin was coiling an extension cord. He looked up as I came near. "You could retire tomorrow," he said. "You control the whole trust now. Why are you still here at this hour?" I looked out at the empty platform where the winter trains would soon pull in. "Your grandmother asked something of me," I said. "Not only to build the foundation to stay rooted beside the people it was built to serve. Wealth turns corrosive when it lifts you away from the ground where dignity actually lives. This shift keeps me honest. Calloused hands working alongside each other, the only inheritance that has ever held real weight." Gavin nodded slowly. He didn't have the full picture yet, but 11 more months of midnight floors would teach him what no business school managed to. I set my hand on his shoulder, firm and warm, carrying 40 years of hard-earned understanding inside that touch. 1 month behind you, son, I said. Let the next 11 do the talking. We went back to work as the 318 Express rolled into the station. Passengers stepped off and moved past us without a glance. We cleaned the platform once they'd gone, newspapers, coffee cups, the leavings of other people's journeys. The night air carried diesel and cleaning solution. My shoulders held their familiar ache. Beside me, my son moved with confidence that was no longer borrowed. He wasn't performing labor, he was inhabiting it. He had stood before 40 families and reclaimed a name he had discarded. He had felt firsthand the invisibility his podcast had packaged as content. He had learned that dignity isn't assembled for an audience. It builds in the unwatched hours when no one is counting the return. Thank you for staying with me all the way through this one. Stories like this one don't leave you easily, and I don't think they're supposed to. Looking back, I understand now what it cost to stay quiet for as long as I did. 40 years of invisible work, a promise kept to a woman I loved, a son who lost his way, and a father who refused to lose him entirely. I believe God places certain seasons of waiting in our lives, not to punish us, but to prepare us. And what felt like silence was actually the slow building of something none of them could dismantle. The grandpa revenge stories that mean the most aren't about settling scores. They're about what a person is willing to become when no one is watching. Here is what this story taught me, and what I hope it leaves with you. First, build your protection before you need it. Quiet preparation outlasts loud ambition every single time. Second, dignity is not a costume you wear for others. It is the daily choice to do honest work even when the room is empty. Third, if someone close to you is being used as a weapon against you, look past them to find the hand holding the grip. Fourth, real redemption has no audience. It shows up at midnight and does the work anyway. These are the kinds of father stories I carry with me. Not the ones where everything is easy, but the ones where a person holds their integrity so tightly that the truth eventually has no choice but to come out on its own. If this story moved you, leave a thought in the comments. I read them, and your words matter more than you know. If someone in your life needs to hear something like this today, please pass it along to them. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.